Hey guys, tonight we slip into a dream that smells faintly of gunpowder smoke and salted sea air, as you find yourself walking along the docks of Canton in the early 1800s. Lanterns flicker against a humid river breeze, junks creak against their moorings, and somewhere nearby a British merchant whispers to a Chinese broker, not about silk or porcelain, but about a sticky brown substance wrapped in little packages. This is opium, and you're about to see how a craving on one side of the world turns into catastrophe on the other. You probably won't survive this, at least not if you try smoking a whole pipe of the stuff. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, if you want, drop your location and local time in the comments. I'd love to see where and when you're listening. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step closer to the cargo crates, hearing British voices argue in clipped tones about how much tea is leaving China every year. You can almost taste it, the bitter, earthy tang of black tea, brewed strong in London parlours. By the early 19th century, Britain is addicted to the stuff. The catch? Tea has to be paid for in silver, and silver isn't exactly something Britain has in endless supply. The East India Company's balance sheets bleed like a paper cut that won't heal. The trade deficit with China grows heavier each year, like a millstone around the empire's neck. That's when a clever, if ruthless, solution bubbles up. Opium. Cultivated in Bengal under British control, it's packaged neatly and smuggled into China, even though the Qing Dynasty officially bans it. Imagine it as the world's most awkward barter. Tea leaves out, narcotics in. Mainstream historians agree this single trade imbalance is the match that lights the fuse. You walk through a warehouse stacked with opium chests, each marked with the company's seal. The smell is earthy, almost medicinal, but the consequences are anything but healing. Chinese officials complain that silver is draining out of the empire, while villages sag under the weight of addiction. Quirky fact here, some addicts weren't just smoking opium, they sometimes mixed it with tobacco, creating a cocktail that made them both wide-eyed and half asleep at once. Not exactly the productivity hack you'd want before going to plough a rice field. Meanwhile, in the bustling London clubs, men in top hats sip tea and pat themselves on the back. Few lose sleep over the fact that their profits come from wrecking lives halfway across the globe. Some investors joke that they've found the perfect circle. India grows opium, China consumes it. Britain drinks tea, and the money spins around like a Ferris wheel that never stops. The only thing missing, any sense of morality. The Emperor is furious, issuing edicts against the drug. You watch as Lin Zexu, the moral hero of the story, arrives in Canton in 1839 to crack down. He isn't subtle. He orders dealers to hand over their supplies, and in a bold spectacle 20,000 chests of opium are destroyed, dissolved into pits of lime and seawater. If you've ever dumped out a bottle of soda that went flat, imagine that, multiplied by 1,000, with British merchants screaming about their lost profits. The act is meant to be cleansing, a statement that China will not bow to foreign poison. Instead, it becomes the spark that invites foreign cannons. It's here that the line is crossed. Britain claims its merchants' property has been unfairly seized, and the government in London is all too happy to protect the trade. After all, Parliament is laced with East India Company interests, so ships are dispatched, steam-driven, iron-hulled, and bristling with cannons. You stand on the dock, watching dark silhouettes of gunboats slide into the South China Sea. Their chimneys belch smoke like dragons, and their iron shells gleam under moonlight. The Qing Dynasty, they aren't ready. For centuries, they've believed their empire to be the Middle Kingdom, the centre of civilization, with outsiders as tributary barbarians. Suddenly, those barbarians show up with military technology straight out of a nightmare. Historians still argue whether the war was inevitable. Was China doomed by isolation, or did Britain deliberately exploit a weakness for profit? You lean against the railing, considering that uncomfortable question as the tide slaps against wood. The First Opium War begins almost anticlimactically. The British fleet barely has to fire a few broadsides before Qing defences buckle. You picture the confusion of soldiers stationed at fortresses, staring at cannons they've never seen before. A joke drifts through your head. It's like showing up to a Formula One race on a donkey cart, insisting you'll win because your saddle is hand-stitched. Still, the British aren't invincible. Disease, supply lines and tropical heat chew at their forces. You watch as sepoys, Indian soldiers in British service, march alongside redcoats, sweating through their uniforms. It's a global war fought in miniature, thousands of miles from home, but it only takes a few thousand British troops to make the difference. As the crack of muskets echoes through the night, you realise how strange it is that an empire of hundreds of millions is stumbling against just a sliver of Britain's strength. Yet that's the story. Economic craving, political arrogance, and the irresistible pull of profit wrapping both nations in a deadly embrace. You trail behind the retreating Qing forces, listening as rumours spread. The foreigners have magic ships. Their guns never miss. Fear spreads faster than bullets. And you? You're stuck in the middle of it all, watching two empires collide, knowing deep down that the outcome will change not just China, but the shape of the world for centuries. Somewhere in the smoky haze you catch the bitter irony. All of this chaos began with something as ordinary as a cup of tea. You can almost hear the clink of porcelain, the gentle swirl of sugar, and the satisfied sigh of a London gentleman, unaware or perhaps uncaring that his evening comfort rests on the suffering of millions across the seas. The night grows heavier, filled with the sound of waves slapping against hulls and distant cries in the streets. The smell of opium lingers in the air, sweet yet suffocating, pulling you deeper into the strange collision of worlds. You take a final glance back at the crates being hauled away, the merchants arguing, the soldiers preparing for war. The die is cast and there is no turning back. You shuffle through the narrow, crowded streets of Canton, where red paper lanterns sway above stalls selling dumplings, silks, and strings of jade beads. The smell of incense curls through the humid air, masking, just barely, the harsher sense of river mud and sweating bodies. Here in this southern city, the Qing dynasty has tried to wall off foreigners like an unwanted draft. Trade is permitted, but only in this one small corner of the empire, and under rules so rigid they creak. You drift into the 13 Factories district, a row of Western trading houses squeezed between the river and the city wall. Flags from Britain, the United States, Portugal and the Netherlands hang limp in the heat. The foreign merchants live like exiles. They cannot bring their families, cannot wander beyond their compounds, cannot learn the Chinese language properly without permission. Imagine being told you may only eat at one food stall for the rest of your life, and if you try a different one, you risk arrest. That's about how claustrophobic Canton feels to the traders. Inside one of the British hongs, or merchant houses, you hear voices muttering about loopholes. The Qing authorities demand that all trade be funneled through a guild of licensed Chinese merchants, the Kohong, who set the prices and pocket hefty fees. The system works well enough when the trade is porcelain, silk and tea. But when the demand for tea skyrockets, the British merchants grumble that they're trapped. They want direct access, faster profits, less oversight. You sense the frustration bubbling like a tea kettle left on the stove too long. As night falls, you glimpse shady figures slipping through alleys with bundles of contraband. Opium, banned outright, slides into the city in carefully disguised shipments. You lean closer to a crate labelled camphor and catch a whiff that tells you it's anything but. This is how the British merchants find their loophole. If they can't officially balance the trade with silver, they'll smuggle a narcotic until the ledger smiles again. From a balcony above the market, you watch Chinese officials pace nervously. They know smuggling is rampant, but the empire is vast, the coastline endless, and the enforcement patchy. Some mandarins look the other way, pocketing bribes. Others send out raids that seize a few chests here and there, a performance more than a solution, quirky tidbit. Smugglers sometimes hollowed out large wax candles and stuffed them with opium, so if a customs officer lit one, the smell alone could knock him sideways. Not exactly the kind of romantic mood lighting you'd want for an evening dinner. You linger near a tea warehouse as merchants haggle over prices. The British complain they're being squeezed dry by Kohong monopolies, while the Chinese insist that rules are rules. Tensions grow sharper. The Qing court believes limiting foreigners to Canton prevents cultural contamination. The foreigners believe it's a stranglehold on honest commerce. Somewhere in that gap, a war is already righting itself. The emperor's voice is far away, carried through edicts on silk scrolls. In Beijing, he still imagines the Canton system is secure, that foreigners remain in their place. But you can feel in the alleys of the city that the walls are cracking. Foreign merchants mutter that Britain should send more warships, more soldiers, more pressure. Chinese officials mutter that these barbarians should be grateful for any access at all. One evening you hear a gunshot down by the river, an accidental scuffle between sailors and locals. A small thing, but it ripples outward, turning suspicion into fury. This is the problem with Canton's closed gates. When pressure builds and no vent is offered, it eventually blows the hinges clean off. Historians still argue whether the Canton system could have been reformed, expanded peacefully, and prevented war. Was it rigidity that doomed it, or greed that made compromise impossible? You walk back toward the foreign factories, lantern light flickering on brick walls. Sailors drink and sing off-key shanties. Chinese brokers shuffle accounts in ledger books. Opium pipes glow faintly in back rooms. The city feels like a pot of soup left too long on the fire, ready to boil over. And you know, deep down, that it won't take much. A spark, a shove, maybe one arrogant dispatch from London to set the whole thing aflame. But there's another layer to the drama. You notice how Canton itself is changing. The city, once a proud port of the empire, begins to feel more like a pressure chamber. Merchants from inland provinces shake their heads at the strange sight of foreign ships, with tall masts and cannons mounted like steel teeth. Locals whisper rumours. Some say the foreigners breathe fire, others that they are demons who cannot be killed. And yet curiosity blooms too. Chinese artisans peer at imported clocks, telescopes and globes displayed in the factories, marvelling at the craftsmanship. It's a strange dance of fascination and hostility, where envy and suspicion twirl hand in hand. As you wander back toward the riverfront, the air thickens with competing smells. Fried rice cakes, horse dung, seaweed drying in the sun, and faintly, the sweet yet acrid scent of opium smoke drifting from hidden rooms. You picture British clerks counting silver by candlelight, Chinese smugglers slipping past patrol boats, and Mandarins drafting reports that will take weeks to reach the emperor. In the time it takes for one imperial decree to travel from Beijing to Canton, Several more shipments of opium will have already slipped through the net. A joke flickers in your tired mind. Trying to stop smuggling here is like trying to stop pigeons from stealing breadcrumbs in the park. No matter how many times you wave your arms, more swoop in the moment you look away. By the time the city gates creak shut at curfew, you realise Canton is no fortress at all. It is a funnel, narrow at the top but impossible to seal completely. And at the bottom of that funnel, Britain has found a way to pour in something far more destructive than any ordinary commodity. The smoke rising from those hidden pipes tells you plainly. The gates may be closed, but the Empire's defences are already wide open. You wake with the sour aftertaste of incense still in your nose, and this time you find yourself drifting northward, away from the busy markets of Canton to the wide avenues of Beijing. Here, the Qing court rules in silk-clad splendour, but beneath the polished floors lies a nervous tremor. The emperor, seated on his dragon throne, receives reports from provincial officials. The news is always phrased in respectful brushstrokes, careful not to offend. Yet you can tell that beneath the flowery words lies something darker. Silver is draining from the empire and opium is seeping into its bones. You wander the imperial library where scholars pore over Confucian classics, murmuring about virtue and harmony. Tradition rules here. The Qing dynasty prides itself on stability, on hierarchy that seems eternal, on rituals that link the present with the ancestors. But you can also hear whispers. Young men stumbling in villages, their lips stained by the pipe, their hands too shaky to work. Officials in the countryside report that soldiers and farmers alike are being lured into the haze. The contradiction is striking. An empire that calls itself the Middle Kingdom now finds itself pulled off balance by smoke curling from tiny clay bowls. Imagine you're sipping your morning tea and the leaves taste faintly bitter. That bitterness grows stronger each day until it's all you can taste. That's what the Qing treasury feels like, its reserves of silver shrinking as more and more flows outward to pay for foreign opium. The empire once demanded tribute from all corners of Asia, but now its own currency leaks away like sand through a cracked jar. Historians still argue whether the Qing could have modernized its finances in time, perhaps by introducing new taxation or encouraging domestic industry. Instead, the court insists that agriculture is the backbone of society and that trade with foreigners is a minor nuisance. That might have been true centuries earlier, but in your present stroll through these corridors, it feels like insisting that a wooden umbrella will hold during a typhoon. A eunuch shuffles by, carrying a memorial written on stiff bamboo paper. It accuses coastal officials of corruption, accepting bribes to let opium slip through checkpoints. The emperor frowns, then scribbles a command for stricter enforcement. But you sense the futility. The coastline stretches for thousands of miles, dotted with hidden coves. It's as if the emperor is trying to catch smoke with his bare hands. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some Qing officials believe that chewing raw ginger could help detoxify opium addicts. The idea was that the spice's fiery heat would burn away the narcotic's chill. Sadly, ginger did about as much good as trying to cure a broken leg by humming your favourite tune. Still, in an empire desperate for remedies, anything was worth a try. Walking through the Forbidden City's courtyards, you note the paradox. The dynasty looks mighty, its walls thick, its palaces magnificent. Yet you know that inside the bureaucracy creaks like an old wooden ship. Many officials rise by purchasing post rather than earning them. Local magistrates often lack military training, yet they're asked to confront smugglers armed with faster ships and hidden weapons. You almost want to lean over to the emperor and whisper, "Your Majesty, maybe a few cannons wouldn't hurt." But then you remember, cheeky asides to emperors are not recommended for long-term survival. Meanwhile, in the countryside, farmers are torn. Some sell opium themselves since the profits are better than rice. Others watch helplessly as sons and brothers grow gaunt, chasing the pipe instead of ploughing the field. You imagine yourself trudging through a village at dawn. Fields overgrown, tools abandoned, families waiting for men who will not return from their smoke-filled dens. It's no wonder reports reach the court dripping with alarm. You lean against a carved balustrade and overhear two Mandarins debate in hushed voices. One insists that the barbarians must be expelled entirely, that foreign trade is a poison in itself. The other argues that cutting off trade might spark retaliation. Historians still debate this very point. Could the Qing have avoided conflict by opening wider markets and taxing opium heavily, rather than banning it? Or was the addiction already too widespread to manage? The arguments stretch like silk threads, delicate and impossible to untangle. Even the military seems unprepared. Soldiers still carry matchlock muskets and spears in an age when British troops drill with modern rifles and ironclad discipline. Cannons are heavy, ornate, and slow to reload, more like museum pieces than battlefield weapons. You picture a line of Qing soldiers firing once, then spending half a minute fumbling with powder, while a British Marine fires 3 shots in the same span. Not exactly the recipe for victory, yet the court clings to the idea of moral strength over material strength. The emperor believes virtue itself should repel outsiders. He cannot imagine that a few thousand foreign troops might ever threaten the Middle Kingdom. After all, this empire with its millions of farmers, scholars and soldiers has outlasted countless dynasties before. Why should a handful of red-haired barbarians matter? You wander deeper into the palace, where golden tiles glitter under the sun. Courtiers sip tea brewed from leaves grown on imperial estates, their sleeves flowing as they recite poetry. The scene looks serene, almost timeless, and yet you can't shake the feeling that the calm is deceptive. Like the still surface of a lake hiding a whirlpool below, joke number 2 slips into your head as you imagine imperial officials discussing opium at a banquet. One says, "Perhaps we should try some to understand the problem better." The other replies, "Yes, but strictly for research purposes." You can almost hear the nervous laughter. As night falls over Beijing, the lanterns glow and the sound of drums echoes from watchtowers. You sense the dynasty's determination, but also its blind spots. Tradition is a comfort, but it can also be a cage. And the Qing, for all its splendour, seems locked inside one. Somewhere far to the south, British merchants are already planning their next shipments. Warships idle in harbours, their sails ready to catch the wind. Here in the heart of the empire, the emperor still believes his commands will shape reality. But you, drifting between palaces and whispers, already know that the tide of history is swelling, and no ginger remedy, no silver edict, no ritual kowtow will keep it from crashing against these walls. You drift southward again, this time following the scent of salt air and tar as ships creak against their moorings in Canton. The city is alive with noise, hawkers shouting prices, porters heaving crates, translators juggling a dozen tongues at once. It's here, at the edge of the empire, where the Qing dynasty's great experiment in controlled trade plays out. But standing among the warehouses and haggling merchants, you sense that the system is less like a well-oiled machine and more like a dam built of bamboo poles. One good shove and the whole thing might collapse. The Qing government's canton system is supposed to keep foreigners at arm's length. Only a select handful of Chinese merchants known as the Kohong are licensed to trade with the outside world. They wear silk robes and carry themselves with the solemn weight of privilege, but you can tell they also sweat with anxiety. They're squeezed between British demand for tea and the imperial court's suspicion of foreign influence. Imagine being told to sell fire to strangers while making sure not a single spark lands on the palace floor. That's their daily balancing act. You watch British traders line up to buy tea, silk and porcelain, their warehouses filling with chests stamped in black ink. In return, they unload silver, endless streams of heavy coins that clink like falling rain. For a time, it looks like the system works. But soon, the imbalance grows unbearable. Britain's thirst for tea is bottomless, while the flow of silver drains their economy. London's coffers grow lighter each year, and the Crown begins to wonder if perhaps there's another way to balance the books. Spoiler, there is, and it's not exactly going to win any humanitarian awards. Historians still argue whether the British government truly understood how destabilising opium would be, or whether they simply turned a blind eye in pursuit of profit. What is certain is that merchants soon discovered how to smuggle the drug into China, hiding it in false-bottomed chests, bribing guards, and slipping it past the very Qing officials meant to enforce the rules. The Canton system, meant to protect the empire, turns into a sieve. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. Some smugglers used hollowed-out loaves of bread to hide small packets of opium. Yes, bread. Imagine peeling open your lunch only to find narcotics stuffed inside like a very illegal sandwich. It sounds absurd, but when profits are high enough, even bakery goods can become part of global geopolitics. Meanwhile, you overhear merchants complaining about hongs, those huge foreign warehouses along the riverfront. They're cramped, hot, and always under watchful eyes. Foreigners can't even bring their families to live with them, which makes Canton less like a commercial hub and more like a gilded cage. One British captain sighs, saying it feels like being in school detention, except with more tea. Joke number 1 slides in here. Imagine a British sailor asking, "Can I just buy 1 cup of tea and leave?" And a Qing merchant replying, "Only if you buy 300 chests. House rules." You can almost hear the sailor groan, but beneath the humour, you see serious cracks forming. Chinese officials think they're containing foreign influence, but the restrictions only make smuggling more profitable. Bribes grease every transaction. Smugglers recruit local peasants, fishermen, even minor officials, until the entire coastline hums with underground trade. The emperor may issue edicts, but here in Canton, the law bends like bamboo in the wind. The foreigners, for their part, grumble constantly about Qing arrogance. They bristle at the demand that they kowtow, kneeling and touching their heads to the floor, to show respect to imperial authority. Many refuse, seeing it as humiliation. One British merchant mutters that he'd rather drink seawater than bow 3 times before a Mandarin. You stifle a laugh, imagining him slurping from the harbour as a form of protest. Still, the resentment builds. The Canton system, once a proud shield of sovereignty, now fuels mistrust on both sides. Foreigners feel caged, the Qing feel invaded, and smugglers thrive in the shadows. Historians still debate whether a more open trading system might have eased tensions. Some argue that if the Qing had allowed multiple ports, competition would have reduced corruption and balanced trade. Others insist that foreign greed would simply have spread faster, overwhelming local officials no matter what. The truth, like tea leaves swirling in hot water, refuses to settle clearly. You wander through one of the Qing warehouses. Inside, silk bolts glisten, porcelain jars shine like frozen moonlight, and tea chests stack as high as the rafters. A merchant counts coins by lantern light, muttering under his breath. He knows the profits are enormous, but he also knows he's walking a tightrope. One wrong move, one imperial investigation, and his career could collapse overnight. Quirky fact number 2. To avoid suspicion, some smugglers marked opium chests with fake labels claiming they contained fine Turkish figs. You imagine a Qing inspector opening the lid, expecting dried fruit, and instead finding bricks of narcotics. Not exactly the snack he signed up for. As evening falls, you stroll along the Pearl River. Lanterns flicker on the foreign factories, their reflections shimmering in the dark water. Junks glide silently past, some carrying rice, others carrying things no one will admit to. The Canton system creaks on, outwardly orderly but inwardly corrupt. You can almost feel the pressure building like steam trapped inside a kettle. Joke number 2 for the night. Picture an opium smuggler trying to act casual while standing next to a crate literally labelled "definitely not opium." If irony had a physical weight, that box would sink straight to the riverbed. From this vantage point, you realise something important. The Canton system isn't just a trade policy. It's the battlefield where two worlds collide, an ancient empire guarding its dignity, and a restless industrial power hungry for wealth. The bamboo dam is trembling, and when it bursts, the flood will reshape the world. The night air grows heavier as you leave Canton and turn your gaze outward, toward the sea. Beyond the lantern glow of the riverfront, an armada waits. Sleek ships with towering masts, polished cannons, and crews who whistle bawdy songs as they coil ropes and check powder. These aren't clumsy merchant tubs. They're warships, instruments of a nation that just finished fighting Napoleon and is now itching for another profitable disagreement. You step aboard one of these vessels and instantly notice the difference. Everything smells of salt, tar, and gunpowder. Iron cannons line the deck like steel teeth, and beside them sit neatly stacked cannonballs, ready to roll into place at a moment's notice. The crew moves with military precision, but also with the swagger of men who know they carry the latest toys of the industrial age. If China is a slumbering giant, then Britain is a hyperactive child armed with matches, running gleefully toward a haystack. Here comes the mainstream historical fact. By the 1830s, Britain's Royal Navy had perfected the use of iron-hulled steamships, alongside traditional sailing vessels. The paddle-wheel-powered Nemesis, launched in 1839, could plough upriver against wind and tide, a nightmare scenario for defenders used to thinking that shallow rivers were natural shields. The Qing, with their wooden junks and outdated cannons, simply had no countermeasure. But wait, it gets quirkier. Sailors gave these new steamships nicknames like fire-breathing dragons, because Chinese villagers, seeing smoke billow from their chimneys, believed they were alive. Rumours spread that the British had somehow tamed mechanical monsters. One can only imagine a farmer staring at the churning paddles, muttering, "I'm not fighting that thing." Honestly, you probably wouldn't either. As you explore the ship's lower decks, you notice boxes labelled muskets, gunpowder, and less officially, rum, do not touch. Rows of flintlock and percussion cap muskets gleam in oil, while sailors sharpen bayonets in the flickering light. Compared to the Qing bannermen's matchlocks, some of which hadn't advanced much since the 1600s, these weapons are like lightning against candle flames. One British officer brags that his men can fire 3 volleys in the time it takes a Chinese soldier to light one match cord. Historians still argue whether Britain's technological edge alone guaranteed victory, or whether Qing corruption and indecision mattered more. Was it the power of industrialization or the paralysis of bureaucracy? The answer likely lies in both. But standing on this deck, staring at cannons that can blast through walls at half a mile, you're inclined to bet on firepower. Joke number 1 sails in here. You picture a Qing official reassuring his troops. Don't worry, Their cannons are probably just for decoration. 5 minutes later, boom! Half the fort disappears. Talk about awkward morale speeches. The British sailors, though rough around the edges, are drilled like clockwork. One bell rings, and suddenly the entire crew snaps into action. Ropes fly, sails drop, cannons slide into position. You realise that this is more than hardware. It's discipline honed by centuries of naval warfare. By contrast, many Qing garrisons are filled with farmers conscripted part-time, men who might be great at planting rice but have little appetite for facing iron warships. Quirky fact number 2. British gunners sometimes practised by aiming at floating barrels of beer. Imagine explaining that to an admiral. Sir, I improved my accuracy by blowing up alcohol. That's either the most effective training method ever, or the most tragic waste of lager in naval history. Walking toward the stern, you overhear officers discussing strategy. Their tone is casual, even smug. They know the Qing army numbers in the millions, but they also know most of those troops are scattered, under-equipped, and bound by slow-moving chains of command. 1,000 well-drilled men with cannons, one lieutenant muses, can do more than 10,000 peasants with spears. You hate to admit it, but he isn't wrong. Still, historians debate another point. Could the Qing have adapted faster if they had recognised the scale of the threat? Some scholars say yes, that reforms like those later attempted in the self-strengthening movement might have changed the outcome. Others argue the empire was too rigid, too confident in its traditions to embrace foreign technology in time. The jury's still out, though the British cannons didn't exactly wait for Qing consensus. Joke number 2. Imagine a Qing commander trying to counter with a motivational poster that reads, "Wooden ships, still relevant since 1644. Spoiler, the slogan doesn't inspire much confidence when iron hulls are ramming your harbour. The sound of a drumbeat calls the crew to evening watch. Lanterns glow along the deck, casting shadows across polished brass fittings. You lean on the rail, gazing out at the black horizon. Somewhere beyond that darkness lies the Chinese coast, where fishermen cast nets, unaware that industrial-age thunder is about to crash over them. The officer beside you sips tea, ironically Chinese tea, and says, "Strange, isn't it? We come all this way to buy leaves and end up bringing cannons." His words linger like smoke, heavy with the absurdity of it all. Quirky fact number 3 before you go: sailors sometimes trained parrots to shout commands like fire or all hands. It sounds ridiculous, but apparently it helped during noisy battles. Now picture a brightly coloured bird squawking "reload" while cannon smoke fills the air. If that doesn't sum up the surreal collision of empire and absurdity, nothing does. And so, the British fleet waits, bristling with iron and steam, a predator poised to strike. The Qing may still believe their numbers and traditions will hold, but here, under the creaking timbers and hissing boilers, you know better. This is no equal contest. It's an industrial hammer about to fall on a porcelain vase. The dawn breaks, and you find yourself not on a ship this time, but inside a Qing barracks, deep in the heart of Guangdong. The smell here is different: sweat, dust, and the faint tang of stale rice wine. Rows of bannermen sit cross-legged on the floor, their uniforms frayed, their muskets leaning haphazardly against the wall. Some polish their matchlocks with strips of cloth, others simply nap, confident that their sheer numbers will be enough against any foreign intruder. You glance at one of the muskets, and it hits you how outdated it looks. Long, clunky, with a match cord that needs to be lit before firing. Imagine trying to fight an enemy with quick-firing percussion cap muskets while fumbling with a slow-burning string. One gust of wind, one drizzle of rain, and pft, the weapon becomes a fancy walking stick. Here's the mainstream fact. The Qing military, by the 1830s, was a shadow of its former self. The banner system, which had once produced the elite Manchu cavalry that conquered the Ming Dynasty, had become bloated with stipends, corruption, and ceremonial duties. Soldiers were often hereditary placeholders, men more skilled at drawing salaries than drawing swords. Many regiments were under strength, and ghost soldiers, names on payrolls but not actual men, drained funds. Quirky tidbit time. Bannermen were technically forbidden from farming because they were supposed to be warriors first. But since fighting wasn't exactly their forte anymore, many secretly worked as farmers anyway. So, in essence, you had professional soldiers who were really part-time rice planters. Imagine showing up to battle only to discover half your troops had calluses from hoes, not swords. And here's where historians still argue. Some claim the Qing's greatest weakness was structural. The banner system itself had ossified into a privileged caste. Others argue the real rot lay in leadership, with generals who avoided risk for fear of losing imperial favour. Was it the soldiers' lack of skill, or the commander's lack of courage? The debate rages on. You wander into the armoury. It's a mess. Rusting cannons sit unused, many cast centuries earlier. Powder is poorly stored, sometimes even damp. One nervous officer tries to reassure you, pointing at a cannon with ornate dragons carved into it. See? Still works fine. You resist the urge to tap the barrel and ask if it's more decoration than weapon. Joke number 1. The cannon might look great in a museum gift shop, but in battle, it's about as effective as a loud gong. The contrast to the British Navy couldn't be starker. There, everything gleamed and clicked like clockwork. Here, soldiers practiced drills half-heartedly, some firing their muskets into the air at odd angles, others chatting mid-exercise. You watch a squad line up, only for one man to forget his powder. The officer sighs, waves it off, and declares the drill successful. Let's just say that if there were Yelp reviews for military readiness, this barracks would get 2 stars at best. Friendly staff, but terrible efficiency. Quirky fact number 2. Many Qing forts still used fire arrows and signal kites as part of their arsenal. They weren't useless, but against ironclads and artillery, it's like trying to swat a tank with a paper fan. One desperate commander once ordered fire ships. Old boats set ablaze and floated toward British vessels. It worked in Chinese history before, but against paddle-wheel steamers, the fire ships simply drifted harmlessly by, like glowing lanterns on a festival river. You overhear soldiers chatting about the foreigners. Some call them red-haired barbarians. Others mutter about smoke-belching ships that defy wind and tide. Rumours fly that the British carry invincible thunder weapons, that their cannons can strike from beyond sight, that they even eat human flesh. Spoiler, they mostly eat salted pork, which might be worse. Fear grows not from reality alone, but from exaggeration and superstition. Historians argue another point. Could the Qing have modernised earlier if they had opened more willingly to foreign trade? Some say yes. If they had adopted Western weapons in the 18th century, perhaps the balance would have been different. Others say cultural confidence, rooted in centuries of being the Middle Kingdom, made such a shift nearly impossible. After all, when you've ruled an empire for 2 millennia, it's hard to believe you could suddenly be the underdog. Joke number 2. Imagine a Qing general trying to motivate his men. Don't worry, they only have a few ships. Meanwhile, from the shoreline, the men can see those ships glowing like floating fortresses. It's like telling someone not to worry about the elephant in the room. when the elephant is currently stomping your garden. Yet, there's a tragic undertone here. The soldiers aren't cowards. They're products of a system that no longer matches the times. They march in faded silks, clutch outdated guns, bound by rituals that once mattered, but now only waste precious minutes. Their loyalty is unquestioned, their bravery untested, but their tools belong to a past century. Quirky fact number 3. Bannermen received monthly rice stipends from the government, but corrupt officials often skimmed so much that soldiers went hungry. Some even sold their weapons to buy food, which makes for a very awkward supply report. "Sir, I'm ready for battle, but can I borrow a sword?" As the sun sets, you watch the soldiers return to their barracks. Some gamble with copper coins, others sing folk songs, trying to forget the storm gathering offshore. You feel a pang of sympathy. They have no idea what's about to hit them. Iron ships, disciplined ranks, artillery that can reduce walls in minutes. They're about to fight a war with tools from their grandfather's era. And so, you step out into the courtyard, the shadows lengthening across cracked stone. Above you, banners flap weakly in the breeze, symbols of an empire confident in its past but blind to its present. Soon, those banners will meet iron and fire, and you already know which will last longer. You leave the barracks behind and find yourself wandering through the streets of Canton, the bustling port city that had been China's gateway to the outside world for more than a century. The smell of spices, smoke and river water hangs thick in the air. Narrow alleys are packed with stalls selling silk, porcelain and tea, their colours bright against the grey stone. Merchants bark prices, while porters haul sacks of goods on bamboo poles. But beneath the noise there's an unease. You can feel it in the way people glance nervously toward the river, where foreign ships loom just out of sight. Mainstream fact: by the early 1800s, Canton was the only Chinese port officially open to foreign trade under the Canton system. This meant all trade was funneled through a guild of Chinese merchants called the Kohong, supervised by imperial officials. For the Qing, this arrangement preserved control. For foreign merchants, especially the British, it was suffocating. High tariffs, restrictions on movement, and constant bureaucratic meddling turned every deal into a diplomatic headache. You duck into a tea shop where wealthy merchants whisper behind silk screens. They sip green tea, but their real addiction is silver. Here's the problem. Europeans couldn't sell much in China. Nobody needed wool coats or clocks when local crafts were already world-class. Instead, the West demanded tea, porcelain and silk, and they paid in Spanish silver dollars. Mountains of silver poured into China, creating a trade imbalance so massive that some joked Britain was being bankrupted one teapot at a time. Quirky tidbit. Silver wasn't just currency, it was woven into Chinese culture. Taxes were paid in silver, fortunes were measured in silver, and brides often wore silver jewellery at weddings. So when the flow of silver shifted, the entire economy wobbled like a bamboo hut in a typhoon. You glance outside the tea shop. A British merchant in a top hat strides through the street, trailed by Chinese intermediaries. The sight sparks muttering among locals. "Foreign devils" is the polite version of what some call him. Yet others depend on him for business. This tension simmers like a pot left on low heat. Historians still argue, was the trade imbalance itself the spark for war, or was it simply Britain's excuse? Some claim Britain could have tolerated the silver drain if not for its obsession with opening new markets. Others suggest the Crown was genuinely desperate. Without fixing the deficit, national finances risk collapse. Either way, the search for a solution took a dark turn. And that solution? Opium. Imagine you're walking past the warehouses near the docks. Behind sealed doors, sacks of poppy-derived opium are stacked floor to ceiling, smuggled in from British-controlled India. At first, it's a trickle, used as medicine, a mild luxury. But by the 1820s, it's an avalanche. Millions of Chinese, from dock workers to scholars, are addicted. Smokers hunch over ornate pipes, their eyes glazed, lost in dreamlike stupors while their fortunes and health dissolve like ash. Joke number 1. Opium was marketed as a recreational pastime, which is like advertising a hurricane as a refreshing breeze. Here's the tragic irony. Britain, losing silver to China, turned to opium to reverse the flow. Now, silver flooded out of China as addicts sold possessions to buy the drug. Families collapsed, officials despaired, and social order frayed. Opium dens sprouted like mushrooms in damp corners, while smugglers grew rich under the very noses of corrupt magistrates. Quirky fact. Some Qing officials tried dramatic stunts to curb the crisis. One governor reportedly made his staff swear an oath by drinking animal blood mixed with wine, vowing to eliminate opium. It was metal, yes, but not particularly effective. You find yourself in a magistrate's court. A nervous official reads reports of rising addiction, broken families and soldiers too dazed to hold a sword. His face pales, but his hands are tied. Many local officers are on the take, accepting bribes from smugglers. Others are too weak or too high to enforce the emperor's ban. Historians still argue, was opium the true cause of the First Opium War, or merely the spark? Some say the British would have found any pretext to pry open China's markets, drug trade or not. Others argue opium was central. Without it, Britain would have lacked both the motive and the leverage. Joke number 2. Imagine Britain sitting at the world's poker table, losing chips every hand. Then it pulls out a hidden ace. Hey, want to get hooked on something really bad for you? Not exactly sportsmanlike conduct. The people of Canton know something is coming. You overhear gossip in the marketplace. The emperor will crush the foreigners, says one. No, says another. They have thunder ships. You can't fight thunder. Rumours spread faster than truth, but the tension is real. The river is no longer just a lifeline of trade. It's a fuse, and the spark is inching closer. You walk down to the docks, where hulking warehouses groan with contraband. At night, you see small boats slipping across the water, opium hidden under tarps. Guards look the other way after receiving a discreet pouch of silver. The whole city knows, but no one dares stop it. Joke number 3. It's like watching someone build a bonfire in the middle of a fireworks shop. You know it's going to end badly, but everyone pretends it'll be fine. The streets of Canton buzz with contradictions. Merchants grow rich, officials issue futile decrees, and ordinary people suffer. Above it all, portraits of the emperor hang proudly, promising stability. But behind those walls in Beijing, the court is only beginning to realise the scale of the crisis. And you already see how the threads are unravelling, one shipment at a time. You find yourself drifting north, away from Canton, carried along by whispers and rumours that rise like mist from the Pearl River. At every bend in the road, you hear the same anxious refrain. The emperor must act. By now, the Qing court can no longer ignore the obvious. Opium is bleeding the empire dry, draining silver, corrupting soldiers, and sapping the energy of entire provinces. Inside the Forbidden City, courtiers shuffle across marble floors polished by centuries of nervous shoes. Ministers bow low before the emperor, their petitions heavy with dire warnings. One scroll describes villages hollowed out by addiction. Another warns that even officials, men meant to guard morality, are caught in smoky dens, their minds fogged. And yet the emperor hesitates. He rules as the son of heaven, but heaven's will seems strangely hard to read. Mainstream historical fact. Emperor Daoguang, who reigned from 1820 to 1850, did finally take decisive action. In 1839, he appointed a scholar official named Lin Zexu as imperial commissioner, tasking him with stamping out opium once and for all. Lin was no ordinary bureaucrat. He had a reputation for iron discipline and incorruptible morals, a rare alloy in a bureaucracy riddled with bribes. You imagine Lin preparing for the journey to Canton. He sharpens his ink brush like a sword, pens a memorial to Queen Victoria herself, appealing to her sense of justice. He writes, in essence, "Would you allow this poison in your kingdom? Then why do you sell it to mine?" The letter, of course, never reaches Victoria. Some say it was ignored, others claim it was mistranslated. Historians still argue whether the British Crown deliberately brushed it aside, or if it was simply lost in the shuffle of empire. Quirky tidbit. Lin was a man of ritual. Before departing Beijing, he supposedly performed a ceremony of self-purification, bathing in icy water and fasting, as if steeling his spirit for battle not just of soldiers, but of morality itself. You walk with him through the gates of Canton, and suddenly the city feels different. Gone are the furtive whispers and bribes at the docks. Soldiers march, banners flutter, drums beat in the humid air. Lin wastes no time. He arrests smugglers, cracks down on corrupt officials and makes it clear. Opium is an enemy of the empire and enemies will be crushed. Joke number 1. Lin was basically the dad who finds your secret stash. Except instead of grounding you, he brought an army. Then comes the famous moment. You stand on the sands of Human, watching as thousands of chests of opium are dragged out stacked in towering heaps. Lin orders them doused in salt water and lime, then smashed and flushed into the sea. The stench is unbearable, a mix of rot, chemicals, and something almost sweet. Fish float belly up as the tide carries away Britain's fortune. For the Empire, it is a cleansing. For Britain, it is an outrage. Mainstream fact woven deeper. In total, over 20,000 chests of opium were destroyed, worth millions of pounds. For the East India Company and British merchants, it was like torching a stock exchange. You glance at the crowd. Ordinary Chinese cheer, some weep with pride. At last their leaders act with strength. Yet behind the cheers lurks a fear. Britain is not a minor smuggler caught red-handed. It is a naval superpower, with warships prowling the coast. Retaliation is certain. Historians still argue whether Lin Zexu's crackdown was a brilliant act of moral leadership or a reckless provocation. Some admire his courage. He stood against the greatest empire of the age. Others sigh that his rigid righteousness ignored practical reality. Britain would never accept such a financial loss without answering in cannon fire. Joke number 2. It's like slapping away a gambler's dice at the casino table. You win one round of applause, but you're about to get chased out by security with clubs. In the weeks that follow, tension climbs. British merchants retreat to their ships, fuming. Negotiations fail. Letters bristle with threats. You stroll along the riverside and notice the sudden quiet. Fewer boats, fewer stalls, fewer customers. The city is holding its breath. Somewhere beyond the horizon, sails are rising. Quirky tidbit. Lin Zexu believed in combining hard law with moral persuasion. He commissioned anti-opium posters filled with poetry, paintings, and even medical advice. Imagine government PSAs today, but in brush calligraphy. Warning, your lungs will blacken, your children will starve, your honour will collapse. Subtlety was not his style. But the British weren't reading poems, they were loading cannons. And as you sit on the seawall, fanning yourself against the humid night, you spot lanterns bobbing far out on the water. Warships. The thunder ships the locals had feared are here at last. Joke number 3. The Cantonese fishermen say those ships roar like dragons, but really it's just the sound of British sailors complaining about the heat. The fuse is lit. Canton is no longer a marketplace. It's a powder keg, and Lin Zexu has struck the match with his crackdown. You sense it in the silence of the streets, in the nervous way merchants count their silver, in the distant rumble of foreign anchors sinking into Chinese waters. And you, walking in the shadow of these looming ships, realize there's no turning back. You hear the first cannon before you see the smoke. It rolls across the water like thunder, startling birds from the marshes and making every fisherman along the Pearl River clutch his chest. You glance at the horizon. There, dark silhouettes, the outlines of British warships. Their masts slice the sky, and beneath them loom hulls of ironwood, bristling with cannon. Compared to the slender Chinese junks, they look like predators circling helpless prey. Mainstream historical fact. The British Navy of the 1830s and 1840s was the most advanced in the world. Steam power was beginning to supplement sails, iron hulls were appearing, and cannons had a terrifying range. China, by contrast, still relied on outdated junks, gunpowder weapons little changed since the Ming Dynasty, and coastal forts that had not been modernized in centuries. You step into one of those forts now, where Chinese soldiers in silk-tasseled helmets shuffle nervously. Their cannons are enormous bronze tubes, ancient but magnificent, mounted on wooden frames. They look impressive, but they're hard to aim, slow to reload, and liable to crack under pressure. Worse, the gunners haven't faced a real naval battle in generations. One soldier jokes quietly that the last time his cannon fired, it scared away a flock of geese. Joke number 1. Imagine showing up to a Formula 1 race with a donkey cart. You've technically got wheels, but no one's betting on you. Lin Zexu knows the danger, but he cannot back down. He sends urgent reports to the Emperor. The barbarians must be resisted, the Empire's dignity defended. He believes moral rightness can stiffen weak arms. But as you watch the British ships anchor off the coast, you sense that righteousness alone cannot deflect cannonballs. Quirky tidbit. The Qing strategy manual still contained references to fire ships, ancient techniques where you'd set boats ablaze and let the wind carry them into enemy fleets. Some commanders even suggested trying it against the British, but as you imagine a flaming junk drifting toward a steamship, you realise how tragically out of step these ideas are. The Battle of Kowloon breaks out. You're there on the shore as Chinese junks sail forward bravely, banners snapping, gongs clanging. The British reply with a single broadside. The sound is deafening, a chorus of thunderclaps. In moments, sails are shredded, decks splintered, and men dive into the water. The Qing cannons boom back, but their shots fall short, splashing harmlessly in the waves. The range difference is cruel, like children throwing stones at a distant wall. Historians still argue whether the Qing truly grasped how hopelessly outmatched they were at this stage. Some argue that local commanders sent overconfident reports to Beijing, hiding their defeats. Others suggest the court clung to illusions of celestial invincibility, believing the mandate of heaven would ensure victory. Either way, the result was the same. China was sailing into disaster. You follow the panic downriver. Merchants scramble to hide their goods. Villagers pack up belongings. Mothers clutch children. Yet amid the chaos, you can't help but marvel at the British sailors' efficiency. They row ashore, red coats glinting in the sun, moving with drilled precision. They set up artillery batteries as if they're merely laying out picnic blankets. The Chinese defenders, by contrast, shout conflicting orders, struggle with broken supply lines, and sometimes even run out of gunpowder. Joke number 2. It's like watching a marching band face off against kids who just found some kazoos. Another quirky tidbit. Some Chinese soldiers believed Western ships had supernatural powers. Rumours spread that British cannons were guided by sorcery, or that iron hulls were magically impervious. Superstition blended with fear, and fear eroded morale faster than any cannonball. But not everyone ran. You notice small groups of Chinese fighters resisting with crossbows, spears, even homemade rockets. Brave, yes, but tragically symbolic. The kind of courage that makes legends but not victories. The British, with their discipline and modern weapons, tear through these defences. Soon, key forts fall, and the river is wide open. You remember Lin Zexu's burning of the opium, the cheers on the sands of Human. Now those cheers feel distant, swallowed by the roar of naval guns. You sense the weight of inevitability. Once the warships arrived, defeat was less a question of if than how long. Historians still argue whether Britain deliberately engineered this war to force open China's markets, or if it stumbled into conflict out of sheer arrogance. What's certain is that once the first cannon was fired, the negotiations became an extended demolition job. Joke number 3. Calling it a war almost feels unfair, like challenging a heavyweight boxer while holding a teacup. As night falls, you stand on the shore, the air thick with smoke and salt. Fires burn where villages once stood. Across the dark waters, British lanterns glow like a string of stars, steady, unshaken. Behind you, the Chinese countryside is restless, torn between defiance and despair. And you, trudging back through the smoke, realise that this is only the beginning of an empire's unravelling. You move further inland, away from the blackened shoreline where British shells once cracked the sky. The air grows quieter, except for the drone of cicadas and the shuffle of your own sandals along packed earth roads. But even in this quiet, the war lingers. Villages are half empty, shutters nailed shut, and chickens peck nervously at abandoned courtyards. Dogs bark at the scent of strangers, and the few farmers you pass glance away quickly, muttering prayers under their breath. It doesn't take long to realise that the war has already dug into the bones of daily life. Fields go untended because sons have been conscripted. Merchants keep their scales hidden, afraid that wandering soldiers might seize supplies. Mothers hush children at the first sound of marching boots. And though the thunder of British cannons fades behind you, their echo still shapes everything you see. Here's the mainstream historical fact. The Qing dynasty was not toppled by foreign firepower alone. It was already crumbling from the inside. Bureaucratic corruption had eaten away at its core. Magistrates demanded bribes before lifting a finger. Grain meant for soldiers often disappeared into private storehouses. Taxes were collected with cruelty and little accountability. By the time British soldiers arrived, the empire's administrative skeleton was so brittle that even a small push made it splinter. You witness one of those splinters firsthand when you step into a county yamen, the magistrate's office. Inside, the official sits in silk robes, beads of sweat shining on his brow. His desk is piled high with reports of barbarian ships torching villages and of local militias demanding payment they will never receive. Instead of preparing defences, he fusses over a poem, dips his brush into ink and whispers that the emperor's anger will be worse than any foreign cannon. Joke number 1. It's like watching someone reorganise their sock drawer while their kitchen is on fire. Out on the road again. you notice the same flaw repeating itself everywhere. Each governor jealously guards his own province. Supplies aren't shared, soldiers aren't sent across borders, and communication crawls slower than a turtle in winter. The result? Armies arrive late, unpaid, half-fed, and completely unmotivated. Many desert, others turn to banditry. The British don't need to fight a united China. They just need to push against a patchwork quilt already fraying at the seams. And sometimes the response of the people is less about resistance and more about ritual. Quirky tidbit. In some towns, when British forces approached, civilians rang enormous bronze temple bells. Not to rally fighters, no, to ward off evil spirits. They believed the sound could disorient the foreigners. The British, of course, took it as convenient background music while pitching their tents. The further inland you march, the more you see resentment directed not at Britain, but at the Qing court itself. Heavy new taxes are imposed to fund defence, but they fall hardest on the poor. Wealthy landowners bribe their way out of paying, while peasants hand over grain they desperately need to survive. In the countryside, whispers spread. Maybe the dynasty has lost heaven's mandate. Maybe it no longer deserves loyalty. You reach Canton, and the picture sharpens. You expect a disciplined army ready to repel invaders, but instead you find a camp buzzing with gambling, rice cooking, and idle singing. Matchlock muskets lean against tents, uncleaned. Bamboo spears lie in mud. When an alarm is raised, chaos erupts. Some men scramble to arm themselves, others scatter like startled pigeons, and a few rush to bargain with advancing British soldiers instead of resisting. Joke number 2. It's like showing up to play a soccer game only to realise half your teammates thought today was karaoke night. Another quirky tidbit emerges. Some Qing commanders relied not on strategy but on astrology. They consulted diviners to choose lucky days for battle. If the stars were unfavourable, they delayed action, even if British forces were literally on the move. Meanwhile, British officers studied tide charts, maps, and supply lines. You don't need a degree in military science to guess which side had the advantage. Historians still argue whether Qing leaders ever truly grasped how deep their domestic problems ran. Some say they believed that defeating foreigners would quiet unrest at home. Others insist the court understood perfectly, but preferred to deny the truth, clinging to the idea that heaven would intervene. Either way, reforms were postponed, corruption went unpunished, and crises multiplied like weeds in an untended garden. As you move northward, the imbalance becomes impossible to ignore. British forces rarely number more than a few thousand in a campaign, yet every clash is less a battle and more a terrifying demonstration of technological dominance. Villagers surrender before a single cannonball is fired. Officials flee in the night, leaving behind treasury vaults filled with silver syces. When British troops march in, some civilians even bring offerings of food, hoping for leniency. For them, this isn't a clash of civilizations or a debate over opium, it's survival. Historians still argue whether ordinary Chinese saw the British as liberators from Qing oppression or simply new predators. The answer probably varied. In some villages, people welcomed change if it promised fewer taxes. In others, the British were feared as much as the Manchu officials they replaced. Joke number 3. Either way, it was like having to choose between being kicked in the shin or punched in the nose. Not exactly a buffet of great options. And so you trudge on, through rice fields gone to weeds, past temples turned into storage sheds, through towns where bells toll but no defenders appear. The lesson becomes clear. Britain's cannons may have been loud, but the empire was already cracking, The Qing's greatest enemy wasn't Britain at all. It was itself. You drift further along the Grand Canal, that ancient watery artery once hailed as the Empire's pride. The boats around you creak under half-empty loads of rice and textiles, their hulls worn thin from years of neglect. Centuries ago, this canal kept northern capitals fed and armies provisioned. Now, sandbanks choke the channel, bribes stall every lock, and the lifeline of China sputters. The truth seeps in. The Qing war machine isn't just rusty, it's starving. Here's the mainstream historical fact. The British strategy in the First Opium War relied heavily on controlling coastal trade routes and blockades. By seizing ports and disrupting the flow of goods, they forced the Qing court into paralysis. Without functioning supply lines, the empire couldn't mobilize its troops effectively, even though millions of men lived within its borders. You watch grain junks sit idly at docks, their crews refusing to sail without silver up front. Soldiers go hungry. At a small riverside town, you step into a tea house where merchants argue furiously. They're not debating patriotism or loyalty. They're calculating profit. One insists that working with the British will save his fortune. Another worries that if he's seen cooperating, he'll be branded a traitor and lose everything. And then there's the old man in the corner sipping tea so slowly you wonder if he's part turtle. He mumbles, "Dynasties rise and fall, but silver never loses its shine." That one line says it all. Joke number 1. He basically invented cash is king 200 years before your finance podcast host did. But money wasn't the only problem. Quirky tidbit. Chinese armies sometimes marched with enormous painted banners, bright red, embroidered with tigers, dragons, or slogans promising victory. The problem? They were so large they slowed movement, tangled in trees, and made the troops easy targets. British soldiers joked that it was like the enemy showed up to war with parade floats. Meanwhile, inland supply depots are a nightmare of confusion. Ledgers are inaccurate, sacks of rice leak, and carts fall apart on muddy tracks. At one garrison you pass, the quartermaster literally sells off army rations to buy silk robes for himself. Soldiers grumble in hunger, bellies rumbling louder than the distant cannons. Some desert, others raid nearby villages for food. By the time an actual British patrol wanders close, the Chinese defenders are too weak, too distracted, or too bitter to fight. Historians still argue whether these logistical failures were born of corruption, or simply the impossible scale of governing a vast empire without modern infrastructure. Was the Qing state doomed to collapse under its own weight? Or could reforms have patched the system if officials had been willing to crack down? The debate continues, but you see the effects in real time. Famine, mutiny, surrender. You travel north with a convoy of British gunboats. At each port they stop, a routine repeats itself. Cannons boom once or twice, sometimes not even aimed at defenders, just at the water's edge, a theatrical flex. Then envoys march into town with an ultimatum. Surrender your fort, open your warehouses, or burn with them. Often Chinese commanders fold instantly, signing papers with trembling hands. Sometimes they flee and leave their men leaderless. The British hardly break a sweat. Another quirky tidbit. In one encounter, British officers noted that Qing soldiers fired matchlocks from behind walls, but forgot to lower their weapons over the parapet. Their bullets embedded harmlessly in brick and stone. By contrast, British rifles fired with deadly precision from long distances. The clash wasn't just unequal, it was almost absurd. You can't help but notice the strange duality among ordinary people. Some spit curses at the red-haired devils and vow revenge. Others quietly sell food, tea, and even maps to the invaders. Survival trumps ideology. After all, if the emperor can't feed you, why not trade with someone who can? It's not betrayal, they whisper. It's just living to see tomorrow. Joke number 2. Think of it like rooting for whichever sports team currently pays for your snacks. Yet the empire keeps pretending that things are under control. Imperial decrees paint glowing pictures of heroic resistance, while whole provinces quietly surrender. It's like listening to someone brag about their six-pack abs while struggling to climb a staircase. The gap between propaganda and reality widens daily. Historians still argue whether this gap was intentional deception by officials trying to protect their own skins, or whether the emperor truly believed the war was winnable. Some say reports were falsified to avoid punishment. Others claim the emperor's inner circle filtered news so heavily that he never saw the truth. Either way, the result was paralysis. Joke number 3. You might say the emperor was basically running on a 19th century version of bad Wi-Fi. Information kept buffering and never loaded. As you drift further north, the canal grows quieter. Bridges sag, weeds creep into waterways, and shrines crumble on the banks. The mighty empire, once fed and defended by this artery, feels like a giant slowly starving in its sleep. The British don't need millions of troops. They only need to strike where the body's already weak and watch the disease spread. You arrive at Canton again. Only this time the city feels like a different planet from when you first glimpsed its busy markets. The smoke of burned warehouses still lingers, and the foreign factories stand eerily quiet, their flags limp in the humid air. Along the Pearl River, ruined junks bob against the current, their charred ribs poking above the water like bones. This is what defeat smells like. Gunpowder mixed with rotting rice, despair mixed with smoke. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Canton had been the only port where foreign trade was legally allowed before the Opium Wars, thanks to the restrictive Canton system. By the 1830s, however, the British wanted access to multiple ports and freer trade conditions. When negotiations broke down, and the Qing authorities tried to ban opium imports completely, Canton became the first battlefield. You wander through alleys littered with broken porcelain, as if the city itself smashed its finest dishes in frustration. Soldiers limp past, uniforms tattered, muskets missing flints. Some have abandoned their posts altogether. Others sit in circles chewing dried beans and staring blankly into space, too tired even to curse. The British barely had to storm the city. The defenders were already cracking from within. Quirky tidbit. Many Cantonese residents owned fireworks shops, and when the war began, some locals tried to use their supplies as makeshift weapons. Rockets and firecrackers were launched at British soldiers. The problem? Instead of raining terror, they sputtered comically in mid-air, whistling harmlessly and exploding in colourful bursts. British troops reportedly laughed, though they kept their distance since the occasional spark did singe a coat or two. Joke number 1. Imagine being under siege and your big weapon turns out to be what kids today buy for New Year's Eve. You drift into a makeshift command tent where Chinese officials argue. One insists on rallying the people, another urges negotiation, and a third simply fans himself, pretending not to notice the shouting. In truth, no one has a coherent plan. The chain of command is tangled. Orders contradict each other, and by the time a message travels from Beijing to Canton, weeks have passed. It's like trying to run a marathon while sending instructions by carrier pigeon. Historians still argue whether the chaos in Canton was due to deliberate sabotage by corrupt officials, or simply the result of mismanagement. Some evidence suggests that local leaders exaggerated their successes to Beijing while quietly negotiating with British envoys on the side. Others claim the Qing court was simply too rigid to adapt to a rapidly changing war. As you cross a half-collapsed bridge, you see the British encampment across the river. Rows of red-coated soldiers move with mechanical discipline. They unload supplies with cranes, maintain orderly camps and polish their rifles. It looks like a different world. Clean, efficient, relentlessly modern. Their cannons sit in neat lines, their gunpowder dry and ready. You realise that the British aren't just winning battles, they're winning the narrative of competence. Meanwhile, in Canton's Market Square, rumours swirl like storm winds. Some say the British will seize the Emperor's throne. Others whisper that dragons are angry, punishing the Empire for greed. One man swears he saw a British sailor breathe fire after drinking rum. Probably just a hiccup, but myths travel faster than truth. Joke number 2. Congratulations, that sailor just became the unofficial Chinese Godzilla. Trade stalls remain open, because survival never takes a holiday. You see families selling salted fish, rice cakes, and even trinkets made from British musket balls. Good souvenir, one vendor says with a wink, pressing a dented lead ball into your hand. It's surreal. War becomes commerce, even in ruins. Quirky tidbit. Local theatre troupes in Canton actually wrote satirical plays about the British during the conflict. Actors in oversized wigs and fake red coats pranced around, parodying the invaders with high-pitched voices. The plays mocked British greed, but ironically, the humour also revealed a coping mechanism. The population laughed because the alternative was despair. By nightfall, lanterns flicker along the streets. Canton is broken but not silent. People adapt, bargain, and carry on, even under occupation. You can't help but admire that resilience. But the truth remains. The British didn't need vast armies. They just needed to target weak spots. Here, the city that was once the Empire's proud gate to the outside world, and show how fragile the gate really was. Historians still argue whether Canton could have resisted more fiercely with better leadership, or whether the city was doomed the moment Britain committed its navy. Some point to brave local militias who did fight hard, even sacrificing themselves at forts along the river. Others note that corruption, hunger, and outdated weapons meant their courage could never translate into victory. Joke number 3. It's like bringing chopsticks to a gunfight. You can have the best grip in the world, but it won't change the outcome. As you stand on the city wall, looking down at British warships anchored smugly in the river, you realise the lesson Canton teaches. It wasn't brute force that toppled the Qing defences, but the cracks already running through the stone. All the British did was tap them, and the walls came tumbling down. You drift upriver, carried by a slow boat crewed by weary sailors. The Pearl River narrows, and soon you're surrounded not by bustling cities, but by stretches of marshland dotted with reeds. The further inland you go, the clearer it becomes. This war isn't being fought on equal terms. The British are advancing with rifles, cannons, and iron ships, while the Qing defenders are scrambling with outdated gear that would have looked impressive in the 1600s, but not anymore. Mainstream historical fact. The Qing armies still relied heavily on smoothbore muskets, swords, pikes, and bows. Some units even carried spears tipped with iron shaped like tridents. Meanwhile, the British had percussion cap muskets, Congreve rockets, and the latest artillery. It was like watching two time periods collide head-on. One army marching out of the past, the other from the industrial future. You pause by a riverside camp where a ragtag band of Chinese soldiers drill half-heartedly. Their muskets misfire, their powder is damp, and the sergeant barks contradictory orders that no one takes seriously. You watch a young recruit struggle to lift a rusty cannonball, He nearly drops it on his foot before being scolded by an older veteran. The contrast is painful. Quirky tidbit. Some Qing troops were issued shields made of thick rattan, designed to deflect arrows or sword blows. Believe it or not, a rattan shield could actually stop a musket ball at very close range if the angle was right. The problem? Against British artillery, those shields were about as effective as holding up a dinner plate in front of a freight train. Joke number 1. Imagine signing up for war, being handed a woven basket lid and told, "Don't worry, this will stop a cannonball." Further along, you see villagers pressed into service as labourers, hauling stones to build makeshift barricades along the riverbanks. They sing old folk songs to keep their rhythm, voices drifting mournfully over the water. Their spirit is willing, but their defences look like children's toys compared to the British ironclads creeping upriver. Historians still argue whether the Qing's reliance on outdated equipment was due to cultural arrogance, believing traditional weapons were spiritually superior, or simple economic neglect, where corruption siphoned funds that could have modernised the army. Some point to memorials sent by officials begging the court to buy Western cannons decades earlier, which were ignored. Others argue that even with better weapons, the Qing lacked the logistical system to use them effectively. At night, you slip into a small garrison where officers huddle over maps. They debate whether to charge the British head-on or retreat into the hills. One officer pounds his fist, declaring that the spirit of our soldiers will overcome foreign machines. Another shakes his head and mutters that spirit cannot pierce iron. Their arguments echo off the wooden beams, going in circles, never producing a clear plan. Meanwhile, across the river, you glimpse the British preparing with almost clockwork precision. Soldiers test fire muskets, engineers repair cannons, and supply officers distribute rations of salted meat, hardtack and rum. Even their dogs look well fed, while Chinese recruits chew stale millet and pray their powder isn't damp by morning. Quirky tidbit. British troops sometimes practice shooting contests by aiming at floating watermelons on the river. Local farmers were bewildered when their prized melons disappeared downstream, blasted apart by musket balls. For soldiers, it was both target practice and a free snack. Joke number 2. Talk about the original fruit ninja. Except this version comes with a musket. The battle lines form at dawn. You watch as Chinese junks patched together with bamboo scaffolding drift into formation. Crews beat drums to raise morale, their sound echoing across the water. Then British steamships surge forward, smoke pouring from their funnels, cannons ready. One broadside later, and the junks shatter like porcelain. Sailors leap into the water, shields and spears sinking with them. Still, some soldiers fight bravely. You see a unit of bannermen, elite hereditary warriors, charge with banners flying. They swing swords, hurl spears and shout ancient war cries. Against musket volleys, though, it's a tragic spectacle. Their courage is undeniable, but it's swallowed by modern firepower. Historians still argue whether these warriors could have been retrained as effective riflemen, if only the Qing court had invested earlier. Some claim the bannermen were too attached to tradition, unwilling to change. Others suggest they were scapegoated, and the real failure was systemic, not individual. Joke number 3. Think of it like trying to win a Formula One race on horseback. The horse might be noble, but it won't beat an engine. By the time the smoke clears, the battlefield is quiet again. The British push further inland, while the Qing defenders scatter into the countryside, their weapons abandoned. You step carefully over broken rattan shields and cracked spears, realizing how symbolic they are. Brave, handcrafted, even ingenious in their own way, but utterly powerless against iron and steam. The deeper you go into the Qing heartlands, the clearer the cracks become. not just in the military but in the empire's very ability to feed, clothe, and govern its people. You step onto a dusty road leading toward a market town. The smell of fried dumplings mixes with the stench of human waste, and you see ragged farmers lining up to sell their grain at cutthroat prices. Taxes are high, officials are greedy, and everywhere you look, ordinary families are caught in a slow squeeze. Mainstream historical fact. During the 19th century, China's population had exploded to around 400 million, nearly a third of the world's people at the time. Yet farmland hadn't grown to match. Fields that once fed families now had to feed entire clans. Famines weren't occasional tragedies, they were a constant fear. You walk past a government granary, its walls crumbling, its doors locked. In theory, these storehouses were supposed to open during shortages to provide rice at fair prices. In practice, corrupt officials often sold the grain early to line their pockets. By the time famine struck, the storehouses were empty shells. Quirky tidbit. In some regions, families tried to stretch meals by mixing rice with ground acorns or even clay, forming bland, chewy cakes that filled the stomach without nourishing it. Imagine biting into a mud brownie and pretending it was dessert. Joke number 1. You've heard of gluten-free bread. Well, this was nutrition-free bread. The result was predictable. Malnourished peasants had little loyalty left for the dynasty that failed them. When British troops marched through, some villages resisted with homemade weapons, but many others simply watched or even offered food, less out of sympathy for foreigners, more out of resentment toward their own rulers. Historians still argue whether the Qing government's failure to modernize agriculture was due to bureaucratic corruption or structural limits. Some scholars point out that officials were trapped in a Confucian system that valued stability over innovation. Others argue the empire had the resources to improve irrigation and farming tools, but squandered them on palaces, festivals, and internal power struggles. You pass into the countryside where the earth itself looks tired. Rice paddies are choked with weeds, irrigation ditches cracked from neglect. Farmers hack at the soil with wooden ploughs little changed from centuries before. Meanwhile, across the seas, Britain had embraced mechanized farming, crop rotation, and chemical fertilizers. It wasn't just armies that were industrialized. The whole society was. Quirky tidbit. British merchants often brag that they ate better meals on their ships than many Chinese peasants had in their villages. A sailor might chew salted beef and hardtack while villagers survived on boiled leaves. Sailors probably didn't feel luxurious, but compared side by side the contrast was absurd. Joke number 2. Imagine trying to complain about soggy hardtack, only to realise you're still eating like royalty compared to a farmer's leaf soup. Rebellion simmered in this misery. You hear whispers of secret societies forming, groups that promise to overthrow corrupt officials and bring justice to the people. One such group, the White Lotus, had already shaken parts of the empire decades earlier. Others would follow. The irony is hard to miss. While the dynasty tried to repel foreign invaders, its real danger was festering within its own hungry villages. In town you see more signs of strain. Craftsmen complain that British imports undercut their handmade goods. Cloth from Manchester floods the markets, cheaper and sturdier than local weaves. Blacksmiths struggle to sell iron tools because imported steel arrives in bulk. The Industrial Revolution was not just beating Qing armies, it was eating Qing livelihoods. Historians still argue whether this economic collapse was an inevitable result of global trade or a preventable failure of policy. Some argue no empire could resist the tide of industrial imports. Others suggest smarter tariffs or investment in domestic industries might have saved local economies. Quirky tidbit. desperate silk weavers sometimes unravelled their own bed curtains to repurpose thread for sale. Families literally slept without covering so they could survive another week. Joke number 3. Imagine explaining to your kids, "We don't have blankets anymore, but hey, at least we can afford rice." Not exactly a bedtime story you'd want tucked in with. By evening you sit on a hill overlooking the town. Smoke curls from small cooking fires. Families gather around bowls of thin porridge, sharing what little they have. In the distance, British camps glow brighter, stocked with barrels of supplies shipped across oceans. The contrast is brutal. And you realise the Qing dynasty wasn't just losing battles, it was losing the confidence of its own people. Armies can be rebuilt, forts repaired. But when an empire's peasants stop believing their rulers can feed or protect them, the walls are already crumbling from the inside. Night falls over the empire and the scene feels heavy, almost dreamlike. You sit beneath the lantern's dim glow, its light fluttering across the paper walls of a small Canton inn. The wind rattles the shutters, and through the thin barrier of wood and paper you catch fragments of two worlds. British officers clinking porcelain teacups, speaking of schedules, rifles and steamships, and beyond them, villagers whispering resentments, their voices low with grief and fury. It is here, on this knife's edge, that the Qing Empire trembles, caught between the hammer of foreign might and the anvil of its own decline. The strange truth is that, on paper, the Qing dynasty was still formidable. By the 1840s it was among the largest and most populous empires on earth. Its armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Its lands stretched from the frozen steppes of Mongolia to the lush valleys of Yunnan. Its revenues, collected from millions of farmers and merchants, poured into the Forbidden City. And yet, when war came, Britain sent only a few thousand expeditionary troops, barely enough to fill a sports stadium today, and still victory was swift, crushing, and humiliating. You blink, and the paradox remains. How could so much be toppled by so little? Mainstream historical fact. The reason lies in organisation, technology and morale. Britain's armies were drilled, disciplined and equipped with the fruits of the Industrial Revolution. Steam-powered ships could glide upstream against wind and current. Rifled muskets fired farther and more accurately than the Qing's smoothbore guns. Artillery shells exploded with devastating force, while Chinese cannons, many dating back to the Ming dynasty, were clumsy and slow. In the clash of iron and fire, the balance tipped instantly. You recall the heart of the quarrel: opium, a drug smuggled in wooden chests traded for silver, inhaled in perfumed dens where the air grew thick with smoke and dreams. The Qing court banned it repeatedly, declaring it a poison that weakened both body and spirit. Yet the bans only deepened the crisis. Corrupt officials accepted bribes, smugglers bribed patrols, addicts sold family heirlooms for another pipe. Even when Commissioner Lin Zexu boldly seized and destroyed thousands of chests in Canton, Britain's merchants merely sharpened their knives and cried out for protection of trade. When Britain's navy arrived, it was principle versus steam engines, Confucian morality versus industrial cannons. Quirky tidbit. Some opium pipes were carved from ivory or jade, decorated with tiny dragons or phoenixes. Smokers claimed the designs gave them strength, as though art could transform vice into virtue. Imagine today someone insisting their vape pen, bedazzled with a unicorn sticker, makes them invincible. Joke 1. Don't worry, I can quit any time, right after one more dragon puff. Historians still argue whether Britain's victory was inevitable. Some believe industrial superiority made the outcome certain. Others suggest that if the Qing had embraced reforms earlier, adopting Western guns, training soldiers in new tactics, the empire might have resisted far longer. Japan, after all, did just that a few decades later during the Meiji Restoration, vaulting itself from feudal isolation to modern power almost overnight. Could China have done the same, or was its size and bureaucracy simply too vast to pivot? The debate lingers, unresolved. You picture again the shock of battle. Along the Pearl River, ironclads advanced like floating fortresses, their funnels spitting smoke, their cannons thundering. Stone forts crumbled, defenders scattering in confusion as red-coated infantry advanced with mechanical precision. Qing troops in silk robes and sandals, armed with spears or outdated muskets, could not hold the line. And in the countryside, famine gnawed at bellies, corruption hollowed officials, and loyalty to the dynasty waned. Britain didn't really topple a giant. It nudged a tired colossus already leaning on shaky legs. Quirky tidbit. Some Qing generals believed that the sound of gongs and firecrackers would terrify British soldiers, driving them into retreat. Spoiler: the Royal Navy was not exactly frightened by fireworks. Joke 2. Imagine showing up to a gunfight armed with a party popper. By 1842, the story ended in humiliation. The Treaty of Nanjing forced China to open 5 treaty ports, cede Hong Kong, and pay enormous reparations. Even more devastating than the silver and land lost was the psychological wound. The Middle Kingdom, long convinced of its supremacy, had been humbled by distant islanders. Officials in Beijing still wore robes of authority, but the threads had frayed. Historians still argue how to interpret this moment. Some call the Opium War the beginning of modern China, a forced opening to the global order. Others see it as the start of a century of humiliation, when foreign powers carved concessions from a weakened empire. Both may be true. The defeat marked both a painful end and an uneasy beginning. Quirky tidbit. British newspapers back home sometimes buried war reports between ads for soap or corsets. For the average reader in London, the conquest of Canton ranked just below the latest hat styles. For China, it was a cataclysm. Joke 3. Imagine losing half your coastline and finding it reported in the classifieds, right after new umbrella designs now in stock. And so, at last, the answer comes clear. Why did only a few thousand British troops defeat the Qing dynasty? Because Britain fought not merely soldiers, but an entire system already weighed down by contradictions, hunger, corruption, outdated weapons, leaders clinging to ancient certainties in an industrial age. The Qing didn't just lose to Britain, they lost to the momentum of history itself. Now, as your eyes grow heavy, you feel the story soften, the clang of cannons fading into the rhythm of your own breathing. If you're still awake, don't worry. We'll be right here with you tonight, and together we'll drift into our second story, where the lanterns of Beijing burn low, and the night air smells faintly of wood smoke and stale tea. You stand in a China of the late 19th century, a once proud empire that has just been rattled by humiliating defeats at the hands of foreign powers. It's a China that calls itself the Middle Kingdom, yet feels increasingly trapped at the edges of history, as Western gunboats and strange machines thunder into its harbours. You probably won't survive this if you really lived there, because loyalty, reform and the throne all carry risks sharp as a sword blade. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is right now in your part of the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year is 1842, and you trudge along a dusty road outside Nanjing. Your feet crunch on the stones, and in the distance cannon smoke still hangs faintly over the river. The Treaty of Nanjing has just been signed, ending the First Opium War. Britain has pried open China's ports, snatched Hong Kong, and demanded an indemnity that makes Qing officials wince as they ink the parchment. You hear merchants muttering in tea-houses about the unequal treaty, while soldiers grumble that their weapons, outdated muskets and rusty sabres, were no match for sleek British rifles and ironclads. Mainstream history reminds us this was the first of a series of treaties that stripped China's sovereignty bit by bit, turning the mighty Qing dynasty into what foreigners cruelly called the sick man of Asia. As you wander deeper into the capital, Beijing, the Forbidden City looms, magnificent yet strangely fragile. Behind its vermilion walls, courtiers whisper about reform, but their voices are drowned out by others who cling to tradition. Historians still argue whether the dynasty could have acted faster, investing in technology, modernizing the army, and embracing foreign knowledge, or whether resistance to change was too deeply woven into the Confucian worldview. One quirky tidbit. While Chinese officials debated whether steam engines violated cosmic harmony, some locals in treaty ports treated trains as ghostly monsters. In Shanghai, bystanders once scattered in panic when they saw a locomotive belching smoke, convinced it was a fire-breathing demon on wheels. You move among the scholars, those Confucian literati in their flowing robes. They scribble furiously with brush and ink, torn between admiration for Western gadgets and horror at foreign missionaries preaching about a crucified saviour. One night in a tea garden, you overhear two officials arguing. "We must learn from the barbarians to fight the barbarians," one insists. "No," snaps the other. "To invite their knowledge is to invite corruption of our very souls." You sip your bitter tea, unsure whether to laugh or shiver at their dilemma. The Second Opium War crashes down in the 1850s, bringing more humiliation. British and French troops march brazenly into Beijing, plunder the summer palace, and leave it a smouldering ruin. You trudge past charred columns, the scent of burned lacquer and incense still in the air. The empire, so proud of its celestial order, suddenly looks ragged, like a silk robe eaten by moths. In the countryside, you hear peasants mutter about strange omens, floods, famines, and earthquakes that seem to signal heaven's displeasure. Some join secret societies plotting rebellion. Others just shoulder their hoes and hope the dynasty somehow limps on. Meanwhile, reform-minded scholars draft memorials begging the emperor to embrace self-strengthening, to study Western weapons, learn foreign languages, and build modern industry. Their pleas often vanish into the bureaucratic void. By the 1870s, treaty ports are bustling with a bizarre blend of cultures. You wander through Shanghai's international settlement, where rickshaw pullers dodge horse-drawn carriages and street hawkers shout in a dozen dialects. A newspaper printed in both English and Chinese flutters in the wind, its headlines demanding reform. Children of merchant families are sent to missionary schools, learning arithmetic alongside Confucian classics. The clash of ideas makes your head spin, yet the dynasty hesitates. One official shrugs and says, "The barbarians may have strange devices, but they lack moral order. Let us not imitate their chaos." Another counters, "Without learning their science, we will be carved like a melon at their table." Historians still debate whether this tension between cultural pride and practical survival was the heart of China's 19th century struggle. Through it all, you walk the night streets of Beijing, hearing distant drums echoing from the city gates. Soldiers pace, uneasy in their outdated armour. Merchants whisper about silver flowing out to pay indemnities. Scholars bury their faces in books, searching for answers in ancient texts while the world around them shifts. A quirky fringe detail. Some reformers were fascinated by telegraphs, convinced the ability to send messages instantly across wires must involve spirits travelling at lightning speed. In one tale, a Confucian elder sprinkled holy water on a telegraph pole, hoping to cleanse it of demons. The operator simply rolled his eyes and tapped out Morse code anyway. You feel the tension in your bones. China is at a crossroads, stumbling between humiliation and hope. The Duitan, the Great Reform, hasn't yet taken shape, but the ground is trembling with the need for change. Every step you take through the capital feels like walking along a fault line, where one misstep could bring collapse or rebirth. You pause at the edge of a courtyard where a lone scholar reads by lantern light. He mutters lines about strengthening the nation, renewing the people. You sense something stirring in the air, the faintest breath of a storm to come. For now, though, the dynasty limps forward, heavy with the weight of its defeats, uncertain how to face a world that no longer bows before the Son of Heaven. And you, still wandering, feel the curtain lifting on a drama of reform, resistance and revolution that will test every conviction the Middle Kingdom has ever held. You rise before dawn, the grey sky over Beijing still heavy with mist, and the sound of distant gongs carries faintly through the morning air. In the palace halls, memorials pile high on the emperor's desk. Petitions from officials urging a new direction. They call this new push the self-strengthening movement, a cautious experiment in reform that begins after 1861, when even the most stubborn Mandarins realize the dynasty cannot stumble on with muskets, while the rest of the world builds ironclads. You follow the reformers into arsenals by the Yangtze River. The clang of hammers echoes in your ears as Chinese workers, under foreign instructors, try to replicate cannons and rifles. The Fuzhou shipyard hums with activity, steamships being hammered together plank by plank. It feels like progress, but you notice something odd. While the factory churns out Western-style guns, the workers still bow 3 times before beginning their shifts, as if Confucius himself demanded respect before the iron sparks fly. Historians still argue whether this blending of old ritual with new industry was strength or weakness. Mainstream history reminds us. The movement built schools of foreign languages, sent missions abroad, and erected telegraph lines. You pass through one of these new academies and see young men, their queues neatly braided, struggling over English grammar or German engineering manuals. A teacher points to a chalkboard sketch of a steam engine. Some students squint, bewildered, as if it were a mythical beast, while others scribble furiously, eager to master this alien knowledge. A quirky tidbit. When China sent its first group of boys to study in the United States in the 1870s, some wrote home describing baseball games with almost mystical wonder. One lad earnestly told his father that Americans seemed to summon gods of speed with a ball and bat. His father, utterly confused, demanded he return to studying mathematics. You travel next to the railways. Tracks stretch cautiously across the countryside, but each new line meets resistance. Villagers mutter that the iron dragons will disturb ancestral graves. Some claim that passing trains will suck away their souls. In one county, locals tore up the rails in secret and melted them down for cooking pots. Still, the government presses forward, laying lines that snake toward the capital. The movement's leaders, men like Zheng Guofen and Li Hongjiang, are determined but pragmatic. They insist on Chinese learning for essence, Western learning for practical use. You overhear one official explaining this philosophy. Our moral order is superior, but their cannons are useful. We take what strengthens us, but not their chaos. You wonder if that balance is possible, or if trying to graft Western steel onto Confucian roots is like tying wings to a tortoise. Factories rise along riverbanks, but corruption eats at them. You step into a gunpowder works where workers whisper that much of the silver has vanished into some official's pocket. Machines rust before they ever run. Historians still debate whether the movement failed because it wasn't ambitious enough, or because it was sabotaged from within by those more interested in bribes than progress. Yet the empire isn't just copying the West. It's also looking inward for strength. Secret societies resurface, blending nationalism with mysticism. One fringe rumour you hear in a village tavern: a Taoist priest claims he can summon heavenly soldiers to fight alongside modern rifles if only the emperor would believe. The patrons chuckle nervously, sip their rice wine and change the subject. Meanwhile, the world does not wait. Japan, once humbled by China, begins its own rapid modernization under the Meiji Restoration. You cross the sea in your mind's eye and glimpse Tokyo's new railways, military drills and factories humming at full speed. Returning to Beijing, you sense an uneasy fear. If Japan can leap ahead so quickly, what excuse does the Middle Kingdom have? By the 1880s, tension builds. The navy, though modernized on paper, is underfunded. You walk the decks of a Chinese warship, smell the tar and gun oil, and feel pride at the sight of steel hulls. Yet a sailor whispers to you that his wages are months overdue. The ship's guns, impressive as they look, lack ammunition. It's as if the Empire is building theatre props rather than true defences, a quirky little scene. In Tianjin, a foreign observer watches a drill. The soldiers march in Western uniforms, but at the end of the exercise they all bow deeply toward the Emperor's portrait before dispersing. He laughs, muttering, "They fight like Prussians but worship like Confucians." Still, for all its flaws, the self-strengthening movement plants seeds. Young men return from abroad with new ideas, telegraph lines hum, railways stretch slowly, and arsenals produce ships that gleam under the sun. You feel a restless energy coursing through the empire like a dragon stirring uneasily in its sleep, yet whispers of doom follow. "It's not enough," one scholar mutters as you pass him in a corridor. "We modernize our shells, but not our minds." He points toward the Forbidden City. "Until that changes, all else will crumble." His words hang heavy, a prophecy you suspect will come true sooner than anyone wants. As the lanterns are lit again in the capital, you walk the narrow alleys and hear children reciting Confucian classics, their voices drifting through wooden shutters. At the same time, telegraph wires hum above you, carrying urgent messages across provinces. Old and new stand side by side, awkward companions, never quite blending. And as you pause under those wires, the night breeze tangling your hair, you sense the tension building. This halfway reform, caught between two worlds, cannot hold forever. The Empire is still sleepwalking, but the dawn of reckoning is closer than it seems. The dawn haze lifts slowly over the Yellow Sea, and you find yourself on the deck of a Chinese warship. The air smells of salt, coal smoke, and rust. The year is 1894, and the Beiyang fleet, the pride of China's self-strengthening movement, faces its first true test. Across the waves loom Japanese ships, lean and deadly, their funnels spewing black smoke into the sky. The first Sino-Japanese War has begun, and you are about to witness how decades of half measures will play out under fire. You steady yourself against the rail as the order is shouted. Cannons roar. The sound rattles your bones and drowns out all thought. Smoke blinds your vision. When it clears, the horrifying truth emerges. Japanese shells have struck clean, slicing through Chinese ships like a knife through paper. One officer beside you mutters, "Our ships were built to impress the Emperor, not to fight." He is right. Some guns misfire, others lack ammunition. The sailors, many unpaid and poorly trained, scramble with confusion. Mainstream history records this defeat as decisive. The Beiyang fleet, once ranked among the world's top navies, is shattered. Within a year, Japan has seized control of Korea and forced China to sign the humiliating Treaty of Shimonoseki. You walk through the defeated capital afterward, watching as crowds gather outside tea houses to hear newsreaders announce the loss of Taiwan. People murmur in disbelief. Japan? The little brother nation, one man says, shaking his head as if the world itself has flipped upside down. A quirky little detail lingers in your memory. During the negotiations, Li Hongjiang, China's lead diplomat, was shot by a Japanese nationalist. Instead of collapsing, he calmly clutched his cheek and joked to reporters, "I suppose this bullet will earn me sympathy from the Western powers." Dark humour in the face of disaster, but it worked. His injury softened the terms of the treaty, if only slightly. But sympathy doesn't rebuild a crumbling empire. In the aftermath, students and reform-minded officials are shaken awake. The newspapers, now spreading faster thanks to telegraph lines, print sharp critiques of the dynasty's incompetence. Some dare to write what few had whispered aloud, that unless the nation transforms, it will be carved up like a melon. You pass a news stall and hear a boy crying the latest headline, his thin voice trembling in the wind. Korea lost, Taiwan ceded, indemnity demanded. Coins clink as anxious men rush to buy the papers. You wander through a scholar's study that evening, the oil lamp flickering against walls lined with bamboo shelves. Books lie open everywhere. Translations of Western science, histories of the French Revolution, and tracts on Japanese modernization. The scholar sighs, stroking his beard. They learned quickly, we hesitated. Now the cost is ruin. His words echo in the silence. Historians still argue whether this moment was the true birth of China's 20th century reform movement, or merely one more humiliation in a long string of defeats. And yet, even amid despair, sparks of change glow. Young men and women in Shanghai, Beijing and Guangzhou organize reading societies. They devour new translations of Rousseau and Darwin. Some laugh nervously at Darwin's theory of evolution, debating whether it means that nations, like species, can go extinct. If so, one student says with a nervous grin, then we'd better evolve fast. But there's also resistance. In rural towns, elders dismiss these foreign books as dangerous poison. You overhear one farmer grumble, "What good is learning from barbarians? Better to trust the ancestors." His neighbour, sipping tea, replies with a bitter chuckle, "The ancestors didn't have to face Japanese torpedoes." You notice another curious shift. Students begin travelling to Japan. Why Japan? Because it is closer, cheaper, and has already translated Western knowledge into Chinese characters. You follow a small group boarding a ship in Shanghai, their trunks stuffed with notebooks. The air smells of coal smoke and salty spray as they wave goodbye, promising to return with wisdom to save their homeland. Back home, reform-minded officials push for change with new urgency. They urge the court to build schools, expand industry, and reform the military. But inside the Forbidden City, whispers spread that such ideas are too dangerous. Empress Dowager Cixi, the formidable power behind the throne, remains wary of anything that might shake her grip. She prefers grand marble projects and lavish birthday celebrations over risky experiments. You can almost hear her voice in the palace corridors. China has survived for millennia. Why should we imitate the West like desperate beggars? Still, the ground shifts beneath her feet. Secret meetings of reformers multiply. Telegraph messages flash across provinces, summoning young scholars to Beijing. You sit in one such gathering, the room thick with pipe smoke, as a charismatic speaker insists, "We cannot wait for the court. The people must awaken." The audience nods, some scribbling furiously, others wide-eyed with both fear and hope. And while intellectuals debate, common folk invent their own responses. A fringe tidbit emerges. Some martial artists claim that through mystical training, their bodies can resist bullets. In smoky training halls, men practice breathing exercises, slapping their chests and chanting incantations. They believe Western weapons can be undone by Chinese spirit. You watch with a mix of awe and unease as one man confidently stabs a blade into his arm, only to yelp and bleed profusely, ruining the demonstration. The late 1890s feel heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. Railways creep outward, telegraph wires hum, and translation presses clatter in cities. Yet the empire still staggers under indemnities owed to Japan. You hear bankers in Shanghai muttering about silver reserves draining away, ships laden with treasure heading overseas. In the countryside, peasants pay higher taxes to cover these debts, their backs bent in silent misery. And so, under the lantern light of a capital still licking its wounds, the talk of reform sharpens into something urgent, something revolutionary. You can feel it in the air, prickling the back of your neck. The war was not just a military defeat. It was a shattering of illusions. As you drift through the city streets that night, hearing the muffled clatter of mahjong tiles behind paper windows, you realize that China is standing at a precipice. The empire cannot retreat into the past, nor can it yet leap fully into the modern age. And you, walking these alleys with the smell of smoke still in your clothes, sense that the choice ahead will either save or shatter a civilization. You step into Beijing on a chilly evening in the late 1890s. Lanterns swing lazily in the breeze, casting red pools of light across cobblestone streets. But beneath the glow, the city feels uneasy, as if everyone waits for a verdict. China is licking its wounds from the Sino-Japanese War, and reformers are beginning to gather like moths around the fragile flame of change. You follow the hum of voices into a courtyard where young men debate furiously, sleeves rolled up, faces flushed with conviction. At the centre sits Kang Yue. His beard is trim, his eyes sharp, and his words flow like a river fed by countless streams of history and philosophy. Kang insists that China must recreate itself, not just patchwork reforms, but sweeping transformations, modern schools, constitutional monarchy, industrialization. He waves a fan for emphasis, the paper painted with Confucian maxims. Confucius, he argues, was not a dusty conservative. He was a reformer, always adapting to his times. The students nod, some stunned by the audacity of turning the sage into a champion of modernity. By his side is Liang Qichao, younger, fiery, his voice rising with energy. Liang has a talent for words that sparkle and sting. He dreams aloud of a new citizen, not bound by submission but active, patriotic, and creative. His essays, once printed, will spread through tea-houses and academies, awakening minds across provinces. You can almost hear the rustle of pages as printers prepare to ink his manifestos, the smell of freshly pressed paper wafting through narrow alleys. Mainstream history remembers this as the early seed of the 100 Days Reform, yet right now it's still fragile. Kang and Liang are not yet household names, but passionate voices stirring restless hearts. you overhear one scholar mutter that they are madmen with a death wish, while another counters, perhaps madmen are what we need. Historians still argue whether this intellectual moment was genuinely revolutionary, or just the daydream of elites sipping tea under lantern light. But Kang and Liang know how to stir not just scholars, but emperors. In 1898, the young Guangxu Emperor, barely in his 20s, leans in when Kang presents his memorials. The emperor's face, pale and boyish, flickers with determination. He has watched his empire humiliated and longs to act. You feel his eagerness as he reads Kang's proposals by candlelight, the wax dripping down like grains of thyme. In the stillness of the palace he whispers to himself, "We must change, or we will perish." A quirky tidbit. Kang once tried to impress the emperor by presenting himself as a vegetarian ascetic who had visions of divine beings guiding his reforms. Imagine telling your boss, "Don't worry, the gods are on my side," and it somehow works. In the stiff corridors of the Qing court where logic and tradition reign, Kang's mystical aura makes him seem both dangerous and irresistible. The reform ideas themselves are dizzying. Modern schools teaching math and science, newspapers spreading new knowledge, a merit-based bureaucracy trimmed of dead weight, railways stretching like veins across the land. Kang even dares to suggest reforming the army with Western drill masters. One old general scoffs, "Foreign drills! I'd rather trust my ancestors' sword play." You resist the urge to laugh. That same sword had been useless against Japanese artillery, yet opposition bristles in every shadow. Behind silk curtains, Empress Dowager Cixi watches with narrowed eyes. She has ruled from behind the throne for decades, and knows the court like a gambler knows her cards. To her, these reforms smell of danger, not just modernization, but the unravelling of the dynasty's authority. Whispers say she mocks Kang and Liang as bookworms trying to fly. Her network of allies, princes, bannermen, conservative scholars, tightens like a net around the emperor. In one tense moment, you sit in the Forbidden City's Hall of Purple Light as Guangxu tries to push through another reform edict. The courtiers bow stiffly, their long robes sweeping the floor. But instead of enthusiasm, you sense resistance. Faces carved in stone, lips pursed in disapproval. One whispers, "Too fast, too reckless." Another mutters, "This is not the Chinese way." It's like watching a man try to row upstream while the entire river crashes down against him. Meanwhile, outside palace walls, the world stirs with curiosity. In Shanghai, students argue in smoky coffee houses, yes, imported coffee houses, about the future of China. Some idolize Japan's Meiji reforms, holding up copies of Japanese textbooks as proof of what is possible. Others shudder, wondering if China's unique culture can survive such a transformation. One skeptical merchant chuckles, "You can wear a Western suit, but will it stop a Western cannonball?" And then there are the underground readers, the secret study clubs. You wander into one hidden above a medicine shop, where students huddle by lamplight, reading Liang Qichao's essays smuggled in from Hong Kong. Their fingers tremble as they turn the pages, both from excitement and fear, because being caught with these writings could ruin their careers, or worse. They whisper about a new China, daring to imagine futures that sound almost like science fiction. Yet the empire remains split. Farmers in distant villages hear rumours of reform and shrug. "What's a constitution to a man who can't feed his ox?" one grumbles as he sharpens his plough. For them, life remains the same rhythm of dawn, toil, and dusk. The reform wave feels like thunder rolling in the distance, loud, but not yet close enough to bring rain. A fringe tidbit you overhear in Beijing alleys. Some fortune tellers begin claiming that Kang Yue is the reincarnation of Confucius himself, sent to rescue the dynasty. They carve talismans with Kang's name and sell them for good luck. Kang would probably be horrified, or secretly pleased. Either way, it's a reminder of how ideas spread in unexpected ways, mixing scholarship with superstition. By 1898, the momentum feels unstoppable. The Guangxu Emperor issues decree after decree, trying to remake an ancient empire in a single season. But as you watch his thin hand clutch the imperial brush, scrawling bold new orders, you feel the tension rise. His reforms may ignite a new dawn, or set fire to the palace walls. And in the shadows, Cixi waits, her eyes gleaming, her patience endless. You can almost hear her whisper through the corridors, "Let the boy play with his paper dreams. Soon enough, I will decide." The summer of 1898 presses down heavy, the air sticky with both humidity and tension. You trail the Guangxu Emperor through the halls of the Forbidden City, his robes dragging across polished floors, his face pale but determined. Every day brings a new reform edict. Abolish useless sinecure positions, establish modern schools, send students abroad, modernize the army, overhaul the examination system. It's a whirlwind, almost too fast, like trying to rebuild a ship while still at sea. You can feel the Emperor's urgency, as though he believes time itself is conspiring against him. And maybe it is. Reformers gather in hurried meetings, Kang Yue scribbling notes by candlelight, Liang Qichao dashing off essays that spread like wildfire. There's electricity in the air, students debate in tea houses, newspapers shout headlines, merchants speculate on the new China. It feels like a revolution disguised as paperwork. But within the marble halls of the Qing court, the conservatives seethe. To them, Guangxu is no visionary but a reckless boy tearing apart the dynasty's foundations. Historians still argue whether the emperor himself truly understood the full scope of what he was unleashing, or whether Kang and Liang pulled the strings. What's clear is that by August 1898, the court split into two camps, those racing toward reform and those sharpening their knives. You wander into one reform edict reading session. A clerk recites the decree. The 8-legged essay, the centerpiece of the Confucian exam system, is to be abolished. The scholars listening gasp. This essay form has been the measure of intellect for centuries, the gatekeeper to officialdom. To abolish it feels like smashing the imperial temple bell. Some young scholars cheer. Finally, exams will test real knowledge. But others mutter darkly, "If we abandon the way of the sages, what makes us Chinese?" Meanwhile, reform proposals stack higher. Modern military academies to replace outdated banner armies, schools for girls, yes, girls, and even a call to encourage industry and commerce. Imagine being a conservative official, loyal to centuries of Confucian order, suddenly told that women might soon sit in classrooms and merchants deserve respect. No wonder some called it chaos dressed as progress, and in the background, Empress Dowager Cixi. You picture her reclining in her summer palace retreat, sipping tea brewed with chrysanthemum petals. Outwardly she is calm, letting the boy emperor play his game. But you can almost see the steel in her eyes. Reports arrive daily. Memorials from alarmed officials, whispers of treachery, rumours that Guangxu plots to sideline her permanently. The palace becomes a chessboard, each piece moving carefully, silently. A quirky tidbit. During this feverish period, one reform-minded official suggested that Guangxu move his throne out of the Forbidden City, and into the new foreign-style buildings being erected nearby, symbolising a break with the old. Imagine the emperor on a European-style chair, perhaps sipping coffee instead of tea, while courtiers faint in shock. It never happened, but just the idea made conservatives choke on their rice wine. Outside the palace, Beijing feels alive with change. Bookshops sell Liang Qichao's pamphlets as fast as printers can make them. Students form clubs with names like Self-Strengthening Society and National Essence Group. In one smoky tea house, you overhear a debate about Darwinism, whether survival of the fittest means China must reform or die. One farmer listening in spits his tea, muttering, "Darwin or no Darwin, I still have to plant my millet." It's the eternal gap between lofty ideas and daily survival. But beneath the excitement lurks fear. The conservatives rally behind Cixi. Some whisper she's planning a coup. Reformers, sensing danger, plot desperate moves. They talk of calling in Yuan Shikai, the ambitious general commanding modern trained troops to protect the emperor. Liang Qichao insists they must move quickly. If the Empress Dowager strikes first, all is lost. You feel the desperation, as though the walls themselves are closing in. The Guangxu Emperor himself grows paranoid. He sends secret messages to reform allies, begging for faster action. One story claims he even considered fleeing the palace to establish a new court in the south, free from Cixi's shadow. Historians still debate if this was ever serious or just palace gossip, but you can imagine him staring into the dark courtyards at night, wondering if he will wake up as emperor or as a prisoner. By September, the tension snaps. Rumours swirl that reformers plan to arrest conservative officials, perhaps even confine Cixi herself. Conservative courtiers strike first, racing to her side with reports of treason. Cixi, never one to hesitate, takes control. She summons Yuan Shikai demanding loyalty, and Yuan, pragmatic, ambitious, betrays the reformers, revealing their plans. It's like a candle being snuffed out in a storm. Within days, Guangxu is confined to Yingtai, a small island palace in the Forbidden City. Reform decrees halt, the 100 Days' dream collapsing after barely 3 months. Kang Yue flees, disguised, smuggled out by sympathizers. Liang Jichao escapes to Japan, heartbroken but unbowed. 6 reformers are arrested, brilliant men whose only crime was dreaming too loudly, and in a chilling morning scene they are executed at Kaishiku, the execution ground of Beijing. Their cries echo against the city walls silenced by the sword. Ordinary Beijingers whisper about them as martyrs, but life resumes, the market still bustling, the rickshaws still rattling. History moves on, mercilessly, a fringe tidbit. One rumour claims that Kang Yue, during his escape, carried with him a secret talisman said to protect reformers from imperial wrath. Supposedly he dropped it in a river, and from then on, his luck never returned. Whether true or not, it adds an almost mystical footnote to a tragedy written in blood and ink. You stand in Beijing's evening streets, the reform posters torn down, the students silent, the air heavy with fear. For a moment the future feels lost, smothered by palace intrigue. And yet, in distant exile, Liang Qichao's pen is just beginning to scratch paper once more. You realise the story isn't over, it's only changing form. You drift with Liang Qichao as he arrives in Yokohama, the salty air of Japan's ports stinging your nostrils. The steam whistles of ships echo off the bay, mingling with the chatter of merchants, sailors and restless students. Exile is supposed to be a punishment, but for Liang it feels like a second birth. He's surrounded by printing presses, Western books, and a society that has already leapt across the threshold of modernity. Japan, fresh from its own Meiji restoration, glimmers like a mirror of what China might have been, if only the 100 Days Reform hadn't been strangled in its cradle. Liang wastes no time. He sets up newspapers and journals, the Qing Bao, the Xinmin Kongbao, and words become his weapons. You watch him hunched over a desk, eyes bloodshot, scribbling until dawn. His writing is sharp, biting, almost electric. China is asleep, he insists, and unless the people awaken, the nation will perish. The papers spread back to China in smuggled bundles, carried by merchants, slipped under tea-shop tables, hidden in school satchels. Students devour them like contraband candy. Historians still argue whether Liang's exiled journalism had a direct impact on the collapse of the Qing, or whether it merely fanned sparks already glowing. But what's undeniable is that young men and women in Guangzhou, Shanghai and Beijing suddenly had new words for their frustration: citizen, freedom, constitutional reform. Words so ordinary to you today, yet to them as dangerous as gunpowder. At the same time, Kang Yue continues his own flight. He travels farther, India, America, Europe, speaking wherever he can like a travelling prophet in Confucian robes. In San Francisco, Chinese immigrants gather in a cramped hall, listening as he declares that the emperor will return, that China must embrace reform or collapse. Some cheer, some doubt. One cheeky skeptic mutters, "If the emperor can't even escape his own aunt, how's he going to save us?" It's a fair point, but the dream doesn't die. You follow Kang into Canada, where he helps set up reform associations, recruiting Chinese merchants who made fortunes in laundries and railroads. These men, often despised in the West, suddenly feel the pull of homeland pride. They pass the hat, funding pamphlets and missions, imagining their coins as bullets in the battle for a new China. Meanwhile, Liang Qichao in Japan becomes almost a celebrity. His essays paint pictures of a strong, modernized China, railways stretching across provinces, schools buzzing with science lessons, factories churning out steel. He praises Japan, but also warns of it. After all, Japan, once a little brother in Asia, had just defeated China in the 1895 war and was now flexing like a new giant. For Liang, the irony stings. They reformed, we resisted. They won, we lost. A quirky tidbit. In his Japanese exile, Liang once tried writing fiction, hoping stories might inspire people faster than essays. One of his tales imagined a future where China became a republic led by modern-minded citizens. Readers, unaccustomed to political science dressed up as adventure, found it bewildering but oddly thrilling. It might be the earliest Chinese attempt at political science fiction, Jules Verne with a Confucian twist. Back in China, Guangxu languishes in house arrest, pacing his small island palace, forbidden even from seeing trusted officials. Some say he secretly corresponded with Kang Yue, smuggling letters through eunuchs. Others dismiss it as wishful invention by reformers desperate to keep his image alive. What's certain is that the emperor's voice grew fainter, while Cixie's power grew louder. But reform doesn't vanish. Instead, it goes underground, carried by students, merchants, and exiles. Societies spring up across China with names like Society for Constitutional Study or National Strength Club. By day, members run shops or attend classes. By night, they huddle over Liang's latest article, whispering plans for a future where people, not emperors, hold power. Japan itself becomes a kind of safe house for exiled reformers. Cafes in Tokyo buzz with Chinese students debating Rousseau and Montesquieu. Some become so enamoured of Western ideas that they start wearing bowler hats and drinking coffee, as if political change begins with caffeine. You chuckle at the thought of a young revolutionary plotting a republic while nervously clutching his very first cappuccino. But not all exiles agree on the path forward. Kang Yue still clings to the monarchy, insisting the emperor must be restored, that reforms can save the dynasty. Liang Qichao leans toward constitutional monarchy, something like Britain's system. Younger firebrands whisper of revolution, of overthrowing the Qing entirely. The debates grow heated. In one meeting, someone slams the table so hard that tea splashes across a manuscript, ruining half a speech. Perhaps history itself was grateful. It spared the audience another lecture. Still, the writings ripple back into China. Young Sun Yat-sen reads them with interest, though he will later break sharply from Kang and Liang. The seeds of multiple futures are planted here, in cramped rooms filled with ink-stained fingers and half-burned candles, a fringe tidbit. Some reformers in exile believed that simply changing the written language, making it easier and more phonetic, would speed up reform by making learning accessible to the masses. One even designed a bizarre system of symbols, like squiggly shorthand, hoping it would replace characters. It never caught on, but the idea that written words could unlock national destiny lingers into the next century. You walk the Yokohama docks again, hearing gulls shriek overhead, feeling the restless energy in every arriving steamer. Each ship brings news, rumours, and possibilities. The reformers, though scattered, are connected by letters, articles, dreams, and somewhere deep down you realise they're not just writing for their generation, they're writing for you, for the very idea of modern China. But exile is only half the story. Back in China, new storms are brewing, storms that will pull peasants, boxers and missionaries into the same whirlpool. The reformers' words may spread, but action, messy, violent, uncontrollable action, is about to take centre stage. You find yourself in northern China, where the wind bites colder, and whispers of anger spread faster than snow across the fields. Farmers tilling rocky soil glance nervously at the horizon, because it's not just famine and floods haunting them, it's the presence of foreigners, missionaries and railway builders. Wooden crosses rise beside temples, telegraph poles slice across farmland, and suddenly the world feels invaded. Into this resentment steps a strange ragtag movement. The Boxers. At first they look almost like travelling performers. Barefoot men gather in dusty village squares, chanting incantations, beating drums, and claiming they can summon spirits. They leap into the air, slash swords against their chests, and boast that foreign bullets cannot harm them. You watch a boy, barely 12, light a torch, whirl it in circles, and shout that the gods will protect him. Villagers cheer. Historians still argue whether the Boxers truly believed in their magical immunity, or if it was just psychological theatre to fire up courage. Either way it worked. Crowds grew bold, fists clenched, eyes blazing. Soon, the movement turns violent. Foreign churches are burned, missionaries attacked, Chinese converts singled out as traitors. Word spreads like wildfire. Support the Qing, destroy the foreign, a slogan that twists loyalty and rebellion into one cry. You trudge through chaotic streets where signs warn foreigners to leave. Shops close. Fear and fury mingle in the air like smoke. Meanwhile, the Qing court hesitates. Should they crush the Boxers or ride their wave? The Empress Dowager, ever pragmatic, tilts toward opportunism. Some ministers argue the Boxers are reckless peasants. Others whisper they might be useful. like storm clouds unleashed at just the right time. In 1900, Cixi makes her choice. She throws the dynasty's weight behind them, declaring war on the foreign powers. You blink, because yes, it's true. The Qing Empire, already staggering from defeats, essentially declares war on 8 of the most industrialized nations on Earth, including Britain, Germany and Japan. It's like a worn-out street fighter challenging 8 heavyweights at once. Spoiler, you probably won't survive this. A quirky tidbit. Boxers trained with bizarre rituals, such as drinking charms dissolved in water or practicing martial arts routines that mixed opera-style choreography with actual combat. Foreigners watching from city walls often mocked them as magical kung fu clowns, but underestimate them and you risk a spear in the chest. Beijing descends into chaos. Mission compounds are besieged, railway lines severed, and foreign diplomats huddle inside the legation quarter, a fortified neighbourhood suddenly turned battlefield. Cannons boom in the distance, and you hear the echo of boxer drums beating through the night. Food runs scarce. One British officer writes that they survived on horse meat and biscuits crawling with weevils. Historians still debate whether Cixi truly believed the Boxers could win, or if she was gambling, hoping to harness peasant rage as leverage in diplomacy. What's certain is that by siding with them, she pushed China into a disaster that would scar the dynasty beyond repair. The 8-nation alliance marches in. Troops from America, Russia, Japan and Europe storm across China's northern plains. Villagers who once cheered Boxer magic now watch in horror as modern artillery tears through city walls. The contrast is brutal. Ancient swords against repeating rifles, wooden shields against machine guns. You cringe at the imbalance, like watching a turtle thrown into a lion's den. Among the Boxers, some refuse to yield. You see one old man, hair white, charging at a line of rifles with nothing but a spear, chanting to the gods until bullets cut him down. His body falls, but his legend lingers, retold in smoky tea-houses years later. Even in failure, the Boxers fuel a kind of folk heroism, peasants who dare to fight giants. And then comes the sack of Beijing. Foreign troops loot palaces, cart away treasures, and leave scorch marks on ancient walls. Priceless bronzes vanish, ending up in European museums. You wander the ruins of a ransacked library, pages fluttering like wounded birds. A French soldier pockets a jade figurine. A Japanese officer photographs himself in front of the Forbidden City. For outsiders, it's victory. For China, humiliation piled atop humiliation. The Boxer Protocol of 1901 seals the wound. China must pay huge indemnities, allow foreign troops to occupy Beijing, and publicly execute Boxer leaders. It's a national trauma, like watching your home invaded, looted, and then being handed the bill for the damage. A fringe detail. Some Boxers believed the gods had abandoned them because their rituals were corrupted by spies or skeptics in their ranks. In remote villages, people whispered that if only the right prayer had been spoken, bullets really would have bounced off their skin. That lingering what-if haunted survivors, turning defeat into a half-mystical cautionary tale. And yet, even in defeat, something shifts. The Boxers' raw fury shows how explosive popular resentment had become. Reformers in exile take note. The people are awake, restless, and desperate for change. If their energy can be guided, not through magic but through politics, it might topple the dynasty entirely. As the smoke clears, you feel the ground trembling, not from artillery this time, but from the rumble of deeper transformation. The dynasty has survived the Boxers, but only just, and in the ashes, New ideas are sprouting, ideas sharper than swords and louder than drums. The dust of the Boxer defeat still hangs over the countryside like a stubborn fog. You walk along ruined roads where shattered telegraph poles tilt like broken ribs, and you notice something unusual. Despite the humiliation, people are restless in a new way. Instead of retreating into despair, whispers circulate of something more radical: revolution. The Qing court, drained by indemnities, tries to patch wounds with half-hearted reforms, but it's like putting a bandage on a cracked dam. The water pressure is rising, and you can almost hear it creak. In the alleyways of Shanghai and the tea houses of Tokyo, a name begins to echo: Sun Yat-sen. You find him not in a throne room, but in cramped exile apartments. A doctor turned visionary, writing manifestos between patient visits. He looks nothing like a traditional Chinese scholar official. No dragon robes, no calligraphy scrolls, just Western suits, books on medicine, and a burning conviction that China must break free from both dynastic rule and foreign domination. You lean closer as he scribbles down the 3 principles of the people: nationalism, democracy, and livelihood. They sound almost simple, but in a land suffocating under centuries of hierarchy, they are dynamite. Here's your first reality check. Sun spends much of his life not in China, but bouncing across the globe, from Honolulu to London to Japan, begging for money, persuading students, dodging assassins. At one point, Qing agents nearly capture him in London, but friends help him escape through a window, like a spy thriller before spy thrillers existed. Historians still argue whether Sun was more a practical organizer or a dreamer living off donations, but nobody doubts the magnetism of his words. Meanwhile, the Qing scramble to modernize. After the Boxer fiasco, even the conservative court realizes the old exam system, memorizing Confucian classics, isn't cutting it in a world of railways and rifles. So, in 1905, they abolish it. Imagine an exam system that had defined social mobility for 1,000 years, gone in one imperial decree. Scholars burn their ink brushes in despair. Students cheer and rush to study engineering and law. You can almost feel history pivoting beneath your feet, but reforms come too little, too late. Corruption still festers, local officials siphon off indemnity payments, and peasants groan under heavy taxes. A quirky tidbit. In some villages, rumours spread that foreign engineers who laid down railway tracks were secretly siphoning away the earth's dragon veins, the spiritual arteries of China. When new schools rose near temples, locals accused them of blocking cosmic energy. Progress clashed with tradition at every turn, creating both comedy and tragedy. Sun Yat-sen's movement, later known as the Tongmenghui, or United League, gains traction among overseas Chinese communities. Picture him in Singapore, standing under swaying palm trees, rallying merchants with passionate speeches. You overhear him promise that their financial support isn't just charity, it's an investment in a future free of foreign yokes. Slowly, coins and banknotes flow into revolutionary coffers. Back in China, young intellectuals return from Japan carrying radical ideas like smuggled fireworks. They wear Western suits, cut off their queues, the braided hairstyle mandated by the Qing, and whisper that the dynasty is illegitimate. Some form study societies, others collect rifles. You join one gathering in a dimly lit back room, where a student with spectacles thicker than teacups explains how a republic could work. Someone else jokes nervously, "We can't even agree who pays for tea. How will we run a republic?" Everyone laughs, but their eyes shine with determination. The Qing court tries to counter with its own new policies, setting up schools, sending students abroad, even planning a constitution. But here's the catch. Power still flows through Manchu aristocrats and corrupt Mandarins. Reform without trust is like serving soup in a cracked bowl. It leaks everywhere. Historians still debate whether, if given another decade, the dynasty could have reformed enough to survive. Some argue the momentum of modernization was real. Others say the dynasty's credibility was too poisoned. You stand in the middle of that argument, watching courtiers draft a constitution one day, then execute dissenters the next. It's a performance both earnest and absurd. In 1908, Emperor Guangxu dies mysteriously. Some say poisoned by Tixi, who herself dies the very next day. It's like a tragic opera finale. The puppet emperor silenced, the empress who controlled him gone, leaving behind a toddler, Puyi, as the new son of heaven. You look at this bewildered child perched on a dragon throne too big for him and think, this empire is balancing on baby legs. Here's a curious fringe tidbit. Some fortune tellers claim that Puyi's cries during his enthronement sounded like a rooster crowing, a bad omen suggesting the dynasty would not last long. Whether you believe omens or not, the symbolism sticks, retold in hushed tones across the empire. Revolutionary plots multiply. You follow couriers racing along dusty roads, carrying coded letters hidden in false-bottom boxes. One uprising in Hunan fails, another in Guangxi fizzles. Each collapse brings brutal reprisals, but also more martyrs, their names spreading like wildfire. For peasants and students alike, these fallen revolutionaries become proof that sacrifice is noble, that the dream is worth blood. By 1911, the air is charged, thick with static. The dynasty is staggering. Revolutionaries are coordinating, and the people are caught between hope and dread. As you lie awake in a dim inn, the floor creaking beneath rats, you sense that China is about to erupt. And sure enough, the ground begins to shake, not from earthquakes, but from the thunder of rifles and the shout of rebels declaring a new dawn. You drift further along the winding alleys of Beijing, the smell of roasted chestnuts curling through the cold evening air. It almost feels ordinary until you notice the unusual hush beneath the chatter. The court has just launched the 100 Days Reform in the summer of 1898, and everything feels at once giddy and terrifying. You tug your robe a little closer, like it might shield you from political turbulence. Spoiler alert, it won't. What you see around you is nothing short of dramatic. Overnight, edicts fly from the Forbidden City, modern schools to be founded, examinations revamped, outdated sinecures abolished, and even proposals for a national assembly. For a dynasty known more for clinging than for leaping, this feels like watching your grandpa trade his bamboo abacus for a brand new iPhone. You almost want to clap, except you remember that clapping too loud might get you accused of disloyalty. Everywhere you turn, posters and handbills glow with ideas imported from Japan, Britain, and even the United States. The reformist scholar Liang Qichao, barely in his 20s, is writing at a pace that would make today's content creators jealous. Essays, pamphlets, and speeches streaming out like a one-man newsfeed. People crowd tea houses not just for gossip, but to debate whether constitutional monarchy could save the empire. Imagine your neighbourhood cafe suddenly filled with heated arguments about tax reform instead of latte foam. That's the vibe. The mainstream historical fact is clear. Emperor Guangxu, guided by reformists like Kang Yue, personally issued more than 180 reform decrees in barely 3 months. That's roughly 2 sweeping reforms a day. Productivity that makes your bullet journal look lazy. Historians still argue whether the emperor genuinely understood the scope of what he was signing, or whether he was swept along by advisors. Was Guangxu a visionary ruler temporarily freed from the Empress Dowager's shadow, or just a pawn holding a pen? The debate lingers, much like the faint smell of incense after temple prayers. Here's a quirky tidbit. One decree called for the creation of a modern national university in Beijing, what later became Peking University. In those first heady weeks, students walked in wearing gowns influenced by Western tailoring, but many still carried talismans in their sleeves to ward off evil spirits. You can almost picture them adjusting their spectacles while muttering Confucian aphorisms under their breath, hedging their bets between rational science and cosmic feng shui. Education, but make it hybrid. As you wander through the courtyard of a new modern school, you notice something startling. Young women seated among the rows of pupils. It's subtle, experimental, but real. The Reform Edicts encouraged education for women, a notion as radical in Qing China as free Wi-Fi in the desert. You watch a girl, hair tied neatly with a red ribbon, sketching geometrical diagrams. Her brother beside her looks scandalized. It's both awkward and groundbreaking, a moment of history hidden behind classroom walls. The reforms spill into the military too. You sneak a glance at parade drills where soldiers swap their heavy quilted armour for Western-style uniforms, their matchlocks replaced with German Mauser rifles. A few march with unfamiliar discipline, while others still slouch like they're auditioning for a noodle-eating contest. You half expect one to trip over his shiny new boots. Change never arrives in a straight line. It stumbles, giggles, and occasionally faceplants. The intellectual atmosphere grows feverish. Reformist journals circulate bold ideas. Abolish foot binding, develop capitalism, promote railways, and establish banks. You overhear a heated debate in a smoky tea parlour. One man insists railways will connect provinces and strengthen unity. Another shouts that iron tracks will anger the earth dragon and disrupt feng shui. You quietly sip your tea, trying not to choke on laughter. Progress, it seems, has to bargain with superstition over every cup, but whispers of resistance rise like storm winds. Conservative officials, many aligned with Empress Dowager Cixi, murmur that these reforms move too fast, that they threaten the very fabric of Confucian order. In one memorial to the throne, a scholar complains that abolishing the civil service examinations would strip the empire of its moral compass. You imagine someone today arguing that banning flip phones will destroy society. Same energy. The tension bleeds into your daily senses. You hear the clatter of printing presses as reformist newspapers roll out fiery headlines. You see police ransacking shops accused of harbouring dangerous literature. You even smell the acrid smoke of burned pamphlets curling into the night sky. Each sense reminds you that ideas here are not mere ink. They are combustible material. And the emperor himself. You catch sight of Guangxu only once, in a fleeting glimpse through the lacquered gates of the Forbidden City. He appears pale, thin, almost fragile, yet his eyes dart with a nervous fire. He's trying, you think, trying desperately to drag an empire forward by sheer willpower. Whether he succeeds or not, you'll have to keep watching. As days turn into weeks, the 100 Days reform surges like a flood. Shops buzz with rumours of scholarships to Japan. Military cadets boast about training abroad, and a daring group of reformists even talk of reshaping China into a constitutional monarchy. The city teeters on the edge of transformation. You walk through the streets, sensing the mixture of excitement and dread thick as incense smoke. Still, part of you notices how precarious it all feels. Reform decrees are words on paper. The empire's actual machinery creaks under centuries of inertia. A shopkeeper grumbles that new policies confuse him more than they help. A farmer sighs that railways won't put rice in his bowl. Ordinary people, caught between slogans and survival, seem less impressed by lofty visions. The 100 days will not last. That much you can already sense in the Titan patrols, the nervous silences, the sideways glances exchanged in crowded markets. You might even laugh at how quickly fashion changes. Yesterday's radicals flaunting short jackets, today's cowed citizens quietly dusting off their old gowns. History sometimes moves with dizzying speed, then slams on the brakes. You lean back against a wooden post outside a tea shop, listening to the muffled clang of a distant bell. Somewhere deep inside you realise this experiment, this sudden push for change, hangs on the fragile thread of imperial power, and that thread may soon snap. The summer heat of Beijing lingers, but the fire of reform flickers dangerously low. You wander the same streets where pamphlets once flew like startled pigeons, only now they seem eerily silent. The 100 days reform has collapsed. What began as a torrent of decrees has ended with the crash of imperial authority, and the sound you hear most is the heavy scrape of soldiers' boots. The story unfolds with cruel swiftness. Empress Dowager Cixi, who had watched from the shadows, finally strikes. In September 1898, she stages a coup, seizing control of the Forbidden City. Emperor Guangxu, the young reformer who once dreamed of railways and constitutions, is placed under house arrest on a lonely island within the palace grounds. You imagine him staring out at the still water, a prisoner of his own court, listening to the distant cries of palace eunuchs. The irony is bitter. The Son of Heaven reduced to pacing a tiny courtyard. Mainstream historians agree on the basic sequence. Guangxu issued reform edicts for roughly 103 days before Cixi intervened. 6 leading reformers, including the brilliant Tan Sitong, were executed. Others, like Liang Qichao and Kang Yuwei, fled abroad, their words now travelling faster than their bodies. Reform was silenced by the sword, but not extinguished entirely. Scholars often debate. Did the reformers fail because they moved too fast, or because they lacked support beyond the scholar gentry class? You overhear echoes of this question in every market conversation, as if the city itself is chewing on history. A quirky tidbit emerges in the gossip. Tan Sitong, before his execution, reportedly refused offers to escape. He believed his death would shake awake the slumbering masses. He compared himself to iron needing to be smelted in the furnace of sacrifice. Some whispered he walked to the execution ground with calm dignity, even joking with guards. You can almost see him, robes fluttering in the late autumn wind, leaving behind a legend more potent than any decree. The crackdown spreads like frost. Reformist journals are banned, printing presses sit idle. Scholars who once debated railways now speak only of Confucius. Even in tea houses where talk was once bold, conversations shrink into whispers. You notice how men bow their heads more deeply when greeting officials, how shopkeepers hide Western books beneath piles of rice paper. Fear hangs in the air like dust in sunlight, visible, heavy, inescapable. Yet not everything vanishes. You stumble into a lecture hall late one evening, lanterns flickering against rough plaster walls. A teacher speaks cautiously, cloaking reformist ideas in metaphors. He recites a poem about new shoots after fire, and the students nod knowingly. The message is clear. The spirit of reform survives underground, disguised as verse, preserved like a secret seed waiting for spring. It feels almost conspiratorial. You half expect a modern detective to barge in and demand passwords. Military life tells its own story. Soldiers once trained with Mauser rifles now return to their halberds and banners. In one drill yard, you watch an officer reluctantly tuck away a Western-style map, replacing it with the old method of drawing lines in the dirt. The Empire retreats into habit, like a man who tries on a new jacket but decides it's too tight. And yet, somewhere in the back of the drill yard, a young cadet still fiddles with the German bayonet, curiosity not quite extinguished. The atmosphere in the Forbidden City is even more surreal. You manage a glimpse through palace gates. Guangxu, once the reformist emperor, now spends his days writing calligraphy and staring at koi ponds. Rumour claims he begged Cixi to let him continue reforms in secret. Rumour also claims she ignored him completely, preferring to focus on her gardens and opera performances. Which story is true? Scholars argue endlessly. Some portray Guangxu as a tragic reformer, others as an indecisive dreamer. You're left with a haunting image of a man who held the pen of change but never the power to wield it. Meanwhile, exiled reformers abroad stir new currents. In Japan, Liang Qichao begins publishing journals that smuggle reformist ideas back into China. His prose, sharp and stirring, paints visions of nationalism and progress. He writes that China must learn from the constitutional monarchies of Europe and the Meiji reforms of Japan. His words ripple across seas, carried by steamships and secret couriers. You picture pamphlets tucked between crates of tea, smuggled like contraband spices, a small but quirky footnote. Some reformers in exile opened study societies with names so long and elaborate they sound almost like parody. One was titled the Society for the Preservation of National Essence and the Advancement of Civilization. Imagine trying to fit that on a business card. Yet despite the clunky names, these groups became laboratories of thought, where young Chinese students abroad debated the fate of the empire. The wider world watches with mixed amusement and pity. Western diplomats in Beijing send reports back to London, Paris and Washington, describing the reforms as a curious spasm in a dying dynasty. Some compare Guangxu to Peter the Great without power, others to Don Quixote tilting at windmills. The metaphors fly as freely as the pigeons circling the city walls. You realise that while the West debates China's reform in witty letters, real lives are being torn apart on Beijing's cobblestones. Ordinary people, too, feel the aftermath. A blacksmith you meet complains that his son lost a scholarship promised by reform decrees. A widow mutters that the crackdown restored the examination system, forcing her nephew back into endless rote memorization. Progress, she sighs, is like water carried in a leaky bucket, never reaching the fields where it's most needed. As dusk falls one evening, you sit by the moat of the Forbidden City. The water reflects lanterns swaying in the autumn breeze. Somewhere beyond the red walls, an emperor sits in confinement, a dowager rules with iron grip, and reformers scatter like leaves in the wind. You think of Tan Sitong's words, that sometimes blood must water the roots of change. The question gnaws at you. Has the sacrifice planted something enduring, or will the soil of empire choke it? The wind carries the faint notes of an opera aria from Cixi's private theatre. The melody is beautiful, haunting. You realise this is how history often sounds, not as a march of progress, but as overlapping songs, some triumphant, some tragic, some absurd. You listen, feeling the weight of the century pressing forward, even as the palace walls seem frozen in time. The embers of reform smoulder quietly in Beijing, but beyond the empire's borders, sparks are catching. You follow the trail outward, as exiled reformers scatter like migratory birds. Shanghai, Yokohama, Singapore, San Francisco, Each becomes a stage where Chinese thinkers gather, plotting futures their homeland will not yet allow. Your first stop is Yokohama, Japan. The docks are alive with the shouts of sailors unloading crates of silk and tea, yet hidden among them are bundles of newspapers and journals written in sharp, radical Chinese characters. This is where Liang Qixiao, the brilliant protégé of Kang Yue, begins his second act. After fleeing Beijing, he pours his energies into journalism, launching periodicals like Qing Bao and later Xinmin Kongbao. These papers are small in size but vast in impact, cheaply printed, smuggled back into China by merchants and students. You imagine a tea shop owner in Guangzhou quietly sliding one beneath his counter, waiting for trusted readers to arrive. Mainstream historians see Liang's writings as a bridge between reform and revolution. He no longer speaks only of tinkering with institutions. He now calls for a new kind of citizen, educated and conscious of national identity. He coins the term Xinmin, new people, arguing that without civic virtue no constitution could succeed. To Liang, reform was not just about emperors and edicts, it was about reshaping the very souls of the Chinese. A quirky tidbit comes from Liang's time in Japan. He was fascinated by sumo wrestling, reportedly attending matches and commenting on how the bouts symbolized discipline and national spirit. Imagine him scribbling notes about parliamentary reform while a wrestler thundered to the mat beside him. This blend of cultural curiosity and political urgency makes him seem less like a distant historical figure and more like a restless traveller, trying to absorb the world and refashion China in its light. Other exiles gather too. Kang Yue found study societies with names as elaborate as his ambitions. The Protect the Emperor Society, for instance, whose mission was to restore Guangxu to power. Meetings often took place in rented tea halls, with members nervously glancing over their shoulders in case of spies. In practice, these societies blended earnest scholarship with the mood of a clandestine club. You picture candles flickering over scrolls, whispers of reform mingling with the clink of teacups. Yet not all paths lead to cautious reform. In Tokyo boarding houses and Hong Kong print shops, more radical figures emerge, men like Sun Yat-sen, whose vision extends beyond constitutional monarchy to full republican revolution. Here lies the great divergence. While Liang still clings to the hope of reforming the dynasty, Sun openly declares that the Qing must fall. The debate splits Chinese exiles into factions, reformists who dream of a modernized empire, and revolutionaries who envision a nation reborn without emperors. Historians often argue over this moment. Was it inevitable that reform would give way to revolution? Some claim the brutality of the 1898 crackdown convinced many that the Qing court would never yield voluntarily. Others suggest reform and revolution were twin rivers, flowing side by side but never merging until the torrents of 1911. As you listen to arguments in smoky Japanese cafes, you sense how fluid these identities were. A student might attend a lecture by Liang in the morning, then secretly donate coins to Sun's revolutionary fund in the evening. Loyalties flickered like lantern flames in the wind. Meanwhile, secret societies within China take on new life. Groups such as the Triads and the Heaven and Earth Society, long active as underground brotherhoods, now find fresh purpose in nationalism. What once was an oath-bound fraternity of smugglers and gamblers begins to dress its rituals in patriotic language. A whispered initiation in a Guangdong warehouse might include vows not only to one's brothers, but also to the salvation of China. You stumble upon one such ceremony, half religious, half theatrical, with incense smoke curling around swords and paper talismans. The atmosphere is both solemn and strangely carnival-like, as if rebellion itself were a sacred performance. Western observers watch with fascination and suspicion. Missionaries in treaty ports report on the rise of strange Chinese lodges where men chant slogans against foreign imperialism. Newspapers in London and New York pick up these reports, often exaggerating them into tales of shadowy conspiracies. You imagine a Victorian reader sipping tea by the fireplace, muttering about the Oriental secret societies, unaware that these same groups might one day topple an empire. A small but colourful anecdote. In San Francisco's Chinatown, a reformist society once disguised its political meetings as opera rehearsals. Members would gather in costume, pretending to practice roles from classical plays, while actually plotting how to send funds back to China. To an outsider it was noise and music. To insiders it was a rehearsal not of theatre, but of revolution. Yet life for exiles is not glamorous. Many struggle with poverty, scraping together coins for rent or skipping meals to fund printing presses. Liang Qichao himself often relied on Japanese patrons to keep his publications alive. Sun Yat-sen, meanwhile, spent years raising money abroad, travelling from Southeast Asia to Hawaii to London, living out of suitcases and always fearing assassination attempts by Qing agents. Revolution, you realise, is not only fought on battlefields, it is carried in ink-stained fingers, in sleepless journeys across oceans, in whispered pledges made over borrowed teapots. The wider Chinese diaspora begins to stir as well. In Malaya, Singapore and the Philippines, overseas Chinese merchants donate funds to reformist and revolutionary causes. Some contribute out of conviction, others out of hope that political change would protect their businesses. This global network of remittances and newspapers transforms the struggle into something unprecedented, a transnational Chinese political awakening. And always the ghost of the 100 Days Reform hovers. Liang Qichao writes elegies for Tan Sitong, portraying him as a martyr whose blood fertilized the soil of change. Secret societies invoke his name in oaths. Even Sun Yat-sen, though critical of Liang's moderation, respects Tan's sacrifice. The executed reformer becomes a symbol shared across factions, a reminder that the cost of inaction is stagnation and the price of daring is death. One night in Yokohama you walk past a boarding house lit by oil lamps. Inside, voices rise and fall, arguments about monarchies, republics, constitutions, revolutions. The windows glow like restless eyes. You realise that though the Qing court silenced reform in Beijing, the world beyond is buzzing with Chinese voices louder than ever. The empire tried to close its gates, but ideas have already slipped through, carried by ships, by letters, by the restless determination of those who will not be quiet. As dawn breaks, the harbour hums with activity. Steamships whistle, gulls circle, dock workers shout. Among the cargo are not only crates of silk and porcelain, but also pamphlets, journals, secret letters tucked into false compartments. The tide is rising, and with it, a new tide of thought. Somewhere in these restless waves lies the seed of China's next great transformation. You turn from the exile cafes of Yokohama and the ink-stained presses of Singapore back to the heart of China, where discontent smoulders not in pamphlets, but in fists and chants. It is the year 1899, and the northern plains, already battered by drought and famine, are about to ignite in a movement both mysterious and ferocious. The Boxer Uprising, or as the Chinese themselves called it, the Yihekuan, the righteous and harmonious fists. At first glance, the Boxers are nothing like the reformist scholars or overseas intellectuals. They are peasants, labourers, itinerant fighters, men and women hardened by poverty, by years of watching foreign powers carve China like a melon. Missionaries build churches in their villages. Foreign merchants extract resources. Railway lines cut across sacred fields. Where Liang Qichao wrote of civic virtue, the Boxers speak through ritual and sword dance. Their language is not parliamentary but mystical. Invulnerability charms, trance rituals, the belief that through martial practice and spirit possession they could channel divine power. You find yourself in a dusty village square in Shandong. Drums beat, torches flare, and young men circle in furious exercises, their fists slicing the air. Their master chants incantations, claiming that divine spirits will shield their bodies from bullets. To an outsider, it might look like superstition. To those kneeling in the dust, it is empowerment, a way to reclaim dignity in a world where officials and foreigners alike trample their lives. Historians debate the Boxers' beliefs. Some dismiss them as delusion, others argue they were a form of psychological resistance. In fact, similar practices existed across China. Secret societies often blended martial training with folk religion. What makes the Boxers unique is their scale and their direct targeting of foreign presence. They burned churches, attacked missionaries, and clashed with Qing troops who tried to suppress them. Yet ironically, as the movement swelled, parts of the Qing court began to see them not as rebels, but as potential allies. This is one of history's strangest turns. A dynasty that had executed reformers in 1898 now flirted with supporting a populist anti-foreign militia. Empress Dowager Cixi, shrewd as ever, sensed an opportunity. By aligning with the Boxers, she could harness nationalist anger and perhaps drive the foreigners out. In 1900, she declared war on the foreign powers, effectively merging the Qing banner with the Boxer cause. Imagine the scene. Court officials in dragon robes standing beside ragged martial artists, united in a proclamation of resistance. But the alliance was unstable. Boxers marched into Beijing chanting spells, convinced spirits would deflect foreign bullets, while Qing generals tried to fit them into military formations. Foreign observers mocked the mixture. Western newspapers called it fanaticism, painting lurid images of wild-eyed peasants storming embassies. Yet to many Chinese, the Boxers were heroes, the only ones willing to strike back at the tide of imperialism. The climax came during the siege of the legation quarter in Beijing, where foreign diplomats, soldiers and civilians barricaded themselves inside for nearly 2 months. Cannon fire shook the walls. Arrows and bullets whistled through narrow streets, while inside the legations, foreign women melted down church bells for bullets. The world's eyes turned to China, and international headlines framed the conflict as a civilizational clash. Quirky, almost cinematic details emerged from memoirs of the time. Some Boxers reportedly painted talismans on their skin in red ink, believing it would turn bullets into water. Others carried banners declaring themselves the incarnations of gods like Guan Yu, the legendary warrior. In one account, a boy barely 15 faced down foreign troops armed only with a spear, chanting until gunfire cut him down. Such stories, while tragic, show the fusion of faith and defiance that drove the movement. Yet the outcome was brutal. In August 1900, the 8-nation alliance, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, the United States, Japan, Italy and Austria-Hungary, marched on Beijing. Their armies, modern and disciplined, crushed the Boxers and looted the capital. Fires gutted mansions, palaces were plundered, and foreign soldiers posed for photographs beside heaps of treasure. The Qing court fled once again, Cixi retreating into the interior as chaos engulfed the empire. The Boxer Protocol of 1901 imposed staggering penalties, huge indemnities payable over decades, executions of Boxer leaders, and stationing of foreign troops in Beijing. China's sovereignty, already fraying, was humiliated further. And yet, out of the ashes, something paradoxical emerged. While the movement failed militarily, its nationalist spirit spread like wildfire. Intellectuals who had once dismissed the Boxers as backward now admitted their courage. Liang Qichao himself wrote with a mix of sorrow and admiration that the Boxers' blood was shed for the same cause reformers sought, the salvation of the nation. Secret societies took note. The fusion of popular militancy with nationalist goals set a precedent. Where once oaths were about brotherhood and revenge, now they echoed with talk of the nation. Revolutionaries like Sun Yat-sen studied the Boxers' rise carefully, understanding both its strengths and weaknesses. Mass mobilization, they realized, could shake the empire, but without modern weapons and organization, it would collapse under foreign firepower. Another curious angle, Western spiritualists in Europe, reading telegrams of the Boxer rituals, compared them to seances and trances popular in London and Paris. Some even romanticized them as evidence of Eastern mysticism. In contrast, missionaries who had narrowly escaped Boxer mobs told horror stories of brutality. Depending on the source, the Boxers were either noble patriots, dangerous fanatics, or tragic victims of modernity's collision with tradition. In the villages left behind, families mourned sons lost in hopeless battles. Mothers lit incense before small shrines, whispering prayers that their children's souls would find peace. Fields lay barren, houses burned, yet the memory of resistance lingered. A child listening to these stories by the fire might grow up decades later to join a revolutionary army, inspired not by ideology, but by tales of fists raised against injustice. For you, walking through these haunted ruins, the Boxer uprising feels like a thunderstorm that left the air charged. Though it ended in defeat, it shattered illusions that China could remain passive. It showed that ordinary peasants, not just scholars or officials, could become actors in the drama of national survival. It blurred the lines between reform and rebellion, mysticism and politics, tradition and modernity. As dusk falls, you stand at the ruins of a burned-out church in northern China. The walls are cracked, the altar blackened. Children chase each other in the rubble, their laughter mingling with the evening wind. Life goes on, but beneath it runs a current of anger, memory, and longing. The dynasty is weakened, foreign powers entrenched, yet the seeds of revolution are sprouting. From this soil, blood-soaked, scorched but fertile, will rise the movements that carry China into the 20th century. The dust of the Boxer defeat has barely settled when you find yourself pulled into the corridors of the Forbidden City once again. The year is 1901, and the Qing dynasty faces its greatest humiliation. Foreign troops patrol Beijing streets, indemnities bleed the treasury, and every official knows the dynasty is hanging by a thread. Yet within this crisis, something unexpected happens. The court, led once more by Empress Dowager Cixi, turns toward reform with a speed and scale that would have been unthinkable just years before. They call it the Xinzheng, the new policies. Where the 100 Days Reform of 1898 had been a brief, fragile experiment, crushed by palace intrigue, this wave of change is sanctioned by the throne itself. The paradox is striking. The same empress who had jailed reformers now orders sweeping modernization. Cynics whisper that it is merely survival instinct, but for you, walking through the streets of Beijing, the atmosphere is charged with possibility. The first target is education. The old civil service examinations, the backbone of China's bureaucracy for over 1,000 years, are abolished in 1905. Imagine the shock. generations of families had dedicated their sons to memorizing Confucian classics, labouring for decades over brush and ink, hoping for the honour of officialdom. Now, suddenly, that world collapses. No more eight-legged essays, no more examinations in temples filled with rows of cramped cubicles. Instead, new schools spring up, modelled after Japan and the West. You wander into one of these classrooms in Tianjin. Gone are the rigid desks where students once bent over scrolls. Instead, blackboards dominate the front, maps of the world hang on the walls, and students recite not Confucius, but lessons in arithmetic, geography, and political economy. Some even learn foreign languages, English, German, Japanese, signs of a new global consciousness. Yet the transition is uneasy. Elders grumble that the classics are being abandoned, that moral grounding will be lost. Parents wonder if these modern diplomas will carry the same prestige as the old imperial degrees. But for young minds, the change is exhilarating. Suddenly, horizons expand far beyond the 4 books and 5 classics. Military reform comes next. The humiliation of the 8-nation alliance has proven the Qing's armies obsolete. The old banner forces, once the pride of Manchu rule, are ceremonial shells. The Yongying militias, raised by provincial governors, lack coordination. Inspired by Japan's victory in the Sino-Japanese War, the Qing begin to build a new kind of military, the New Army. Officers are sent abroad to study at Japanese academies. Drills adopt German-style discipline. Arsenals attempt to produce modern rifles. In the training grounds outside Baoding, you watch recruits march in tight formation, bayonets glinting in the sun. Their shouts echo with something unfamiliar in Qing history, a sense of national, not just dynastic, loyalty. Yet reforms never arrive in a vacuum. Power struggles flare as provincial governors, emboldened by control over new schools and armies, grow increasingly independent. Zhang Zhidong in Hubei, Yuan Shikai in Jili. These men command not only troops but also modern institutions, making them quasi-rulers in their own right. For you, observing from the sidelines, it feels as though China is decentralizing even as it reforms. The seeds of future warlordism are being sown beneath the banner of modernization. Administrative reforms touch daily life too. New ministries replace old boards. Postal systems are expanded. Railways spread like iron veins across the landscape. In Shanghai, telegraph lines buzz with coded messages, linking provinces faster than any courier could ride. Newspapers flourish, reporting on government decrees, foreign affairs, even serialized fiction that mixes patriotism with romance. The people begin to imagine themselves not just as subjects of a dynasty, but as citizens of a nation. And yet, contradictions abound. The Qing court still clings to hierarchy, still fears the forces it has unleashed. Officials debate whether subjects should be called guomin, citizens, or remain chenmin, imperial subjects. The abolition of the exams leaves thousands of scholars disillusioned, unemployed, wandering the streets with their classical training now deemed irrelevant. Some turn to teaching in modern schools, others join revolutionary circles, their loyalty to the dynasty eroded by the very reforms meant to save it. You find yourself in a tea-house in Suzhou, where a group of former scholars sit hunched over cups of bitter brew. Their conversation drifts between nostalgia and anger. For decades, we memorize the analects, one laments. Now a boy who can count foreign numbers will outrank us. Another spits. This is not reform, it is betrayal. Their words capture the human cost of modernization, the breaking of identities shaped by centuries of tradition. Meanwhile, women too begin to find new avenues. Mission schools, once derided, now coexist with state-sponsored academies for girls. Debates on foot-binding intensify, reformers condemning it as a mark of backwardness. In some cities, campaigns urge parents to liberate their daughters' feet. For the first time, the question of women's place in society is tied to national strength, an early sign of feminism interwoven with patriotism. The atmosphere of the early 1900s is both electric and uneasy. For every school built, there is a riot against foreign teachers. For every soldier drilled, there is a whisper that the dynasty's loyalty cannot match the people's thirst for change. Reform is no longer the dream of a handful of intellectuals. It is reshaping daily life across China. Yet the more the Qing tries to modernize, the more it exposes its fragility. Foreign powers, watching closely, remain skeptical. Some diplomats note that while the Qing adopt Western forms, they lack Western substance. A German drill with a Confucian heart, one officer scoffs at the new army. Others, however, worry that if reforms take root, China could rise again as a formidable power. For Japan especially, a modernizing China is both a rival and a reminder of its own path. As you stand on a railway platform in Wuhan, watching a steam locomotive roar past carrying crates of books, weapons and textiles, you feel the momentum of history. The countryside still groans with famine, superstition and rebellion, but the cities hum with machines and new ideas. The old and the new, the dynasty and the nation, are colliding every day in markets, schools and barracks. By 1905, the Qing appear transformed on the surface. Modern ministries, modern schools, modern armies. Yet underneath, the empire is like an ancient tree with a hollow trunk. The outer bark gleams with reform, but the core is weakened by corruption, debt and mistrust. Those who study abroad, especially in Japan, absorb not only technical skills but also revolutionary fervour. They return not to serve the dynasty, but to imagine a republic. As twilight falls on a reform-era Beijing street, you watch students in Western suits brushing past monks in saffron robes, soldiers in khaki drilling beside bannermen in silk. The world seems out of joint, alive with contradictions. For a moment you realize the Xinjiang reforms are not just about saving the Qing. They are unwittingly preparing the ground for its overthrow. The year is 1905, and the railway stations of China are unusually crowded, not with merchants or pilgrims, but with young men and women, carrying bundles of books and the restless fire of ambition in their eyes. They are boarding steamships for the East. Not America, not Europe, but Japan. To you, standing on the docks of Shanghai and watching their departure, it feels like an exodus of minds. Japan, once a fellow student under Chinese civilization, has now become the new teacher. Since the Meiji Restoration of 1868, it has modernized with astonishing speed, defeating China in 1895, and then, in 1905, shocking the world by defeating Russia at Tsushima. That victory resounds like a thunderclap across Asia. For the first time, an Asian nation has bested a European empire on the battlefield. To Chinese reformers and revolutionaries alike, the message is clear. If Japan can do it, so can we. Thus begins a wave of Chinese students travelling eastward. Some are sent officially by the Qing government, eager to acquire modern sciences, law and military training. Others go independently, scraping together money from families or local associations. By 1907, more than 10,000 Chinese are studying in Japan, the largest diaspora of students the empire has ever seen. When you follow them into the classrooms of Tokyo, you find a heady mix of influences. In law school, students pore over translations of European constitutions, comparing the German Kaiserreich with the French Third Republic. In military academies they marched to the beat of Japanese drums, their uniforms tailored after Prussian models. In normal schools, future teachers learn not only pedagogy, but also the idea that education itself can be a weapon of national revival. But the most intoxicating lessons are not in the curriculum. In smoky cafes of Kanda district, Chinese youths gather late into the night, reading pamphlets and debating politics. Newspapers in Chinese circulate freely, unpoliced by Qing censors. They discover the writings of Rousseau, Montesquieu and Darwin, but also the fiery manifestos of Sun Yat-sen, who makes Tokyo his base. Revolutionary societies flourish. The Tongmenghui United League, founded in 1905, unites disparate groups under the banner of expel the Manchus, restore China, establish a republic, equalize land rights. You sit at the back of a cramped dormitory, listening as a student from Guangdong declaims, "The Qing court abolishes exams, builds schools, raises troops, but for whom? For the dynasty, not for the nation. Only a republic can awaken China." Another from Hunan counters, "If we break too quickly, chaos will devour us. Look at France. Revolution followed by terror. We must reform, not destroy." The arguments are fierce, but beneath them lies a shared conviction. The future cannot look like the past. For women, too, Japan offers unprecedented opportunities. Figures like Chu Jin, the poet-turned-revolutionary, find in Tokyo both education and activism. Dressed in modern attire, she writes essays condemning foot-binding, urging women to cut their hair and take up arms. Her words circulate among female students, who dream not only of personal liberation but also of a China remade. You imagine the shock when they return home, speaking of rights and equality in villages where daughters are still denied schooling. Yet life as a Chinese student in Japan is not all glory. Money is scarce, lodgings are cramped, and discrimination lurks. Japanese authorities, wary of unrest, occasionally crack down on political groups. Still, compared to the suffocating atmosphere of Qing censorship, Tokyo feels like a furnace of freedom. Every setback only hardens resolve. Meanwhile, the Qing government grows nervous. At first, officials hoped that sending students abroad would produce loyal, modernized servants of the dynasty. Instead, many return with revolutionary ideas, questioning the legitimacy of Manchu rule itself. Reports reach Beijing of seditious speeches, of exiled leaders plotting in Japanese cafes. Some in court whisper of cutting off funds, even recalling students home. But the tide is too strong. The impact of these study-abroad years ripples across China. When graduates return, they bring not only technical skills, engineering railways, running schools, drilling troops, but also political blueprints. They translate constitutions, form debating societies, and spread the vocabulary of citizenship, parliament and rights. Even those who do not join the revolution reshape local communities simply by teaching modern subjects or organising student associations. You find yourself in a provincial city, attending a lecture by a returned student. The hall is packed with merchants, teachers, farmers' sons. On the blackboard he writes two characters, Guomin, Guomin, citizens. The crowd murmurs. It is a term loaded with promise, alien yet alluring. No longer are we merely subjects of the throne, he declares. We are citizens of a nation with rights and duties. For many listeners, it is the first time such language has entered their ears. Something stirs in the room, fragile but powerful. At the same time, revolutionary pamphlets smuggled from Tokyo find eager readers. Secret reading clubs sprout in schools, railway offices, even tea shops. The Tongmenghui's slogan, drive out the Tartars, revive the Han, resonates, though not without danger. Ethnic tension sharpens. Manchus are viewed with suspicion. Han identity becomes a rallying cry. You sense that nationalism, once a vague sentiment, is crystallizing into a weapon. Foreign powers watch all this with mixed feelings. Japan encourages Chinese students partly to extend its influence, envisioning a future where China follows its lead. Western observers, meanwhile, fear that radicalism may destabilize their concessions. Yet no one can stop the circulation of ideas. Steamships carry not only cargo but dreams, pamphlets and manifestos. By 1907, the mood among Chinese youth is almost feverish. They return from Japan convinced that history is accelerating, that a decisive break is near. Some dream of parliamentary monarchy like Japan, others of republican revolution like France or America. Still others flirt with socialism, imagining land redistribution and workers' rights. For you, listening to their debates, it feels as though every path of the 20th century is already being sketched in those cramped Tokyo dorms. As you walk the streets of Shanghai once more, you notice subtle changes. Students wear Japanese-style school uniforms, their hair cut short. Newspapers quote Rousseau alongside Confucius. Even rickshaw pullers gossip about the war between Japan and Russia, wondering if China too might stand up. The psychological barrier that Asia must bow to the West has cracked. The victory of Japan has given hope, and Chinese students have carried that hope home like smuggled fire. Night falls on a lecture hall in Beijing where lanterns flicker over a crowd of restless youths. A returning student concludes his talk with words that echo in your mind. The old world is ending. The question is not whether, but how, the new will begin. It is the year 1907. And in the bustling treaty ports of China, newspapers begin to appear like mushrooms after rain. Their names are daring: Minbao, People's Journal; Subao, Eastern Times; Shinmin Kongbao, New People's Miscellany. Some are printed in Tokyo or Singapore and smuggled back into China, folded into trunks of returning students, hidden between layers of cloth. Others, bolder, are published openly in Shanghai, Canton or Hankou, until the censors shut them down. You pick up a freshly inked issue of Minbao, founded by the Tongmenghui under the editorship of Zhang Binglin. Its lead article thunders against the Qing dynasty, declaring it a usurping alien regime. The characters on the page seem to vibrate with urgency. Without revolution, China will perish. With revolution, the people will live. For the first time, such radical language is available not only in whispered conspiracies, but in printed words, circulated by the thousands. Reading clubs spring up wherever newspapers reach. In tea houses, clerks gather after work to read aloud for illiterate patrons. In schools, students pass issues under their desks, hearts racing at the risk of discovery. Even in the countryside, travelling peddlers slip pamphlets among their goods. You see a farmer, his hands rough from the fields, mouthing the words haltingly as a village teacher guides him. Nation, citizen, rights. At the same time, secret societies, the old underworld networks of the Green Gang, the Red Spears and the Triads, begin to intersect with new revolutionary cells. Once these groups had been concerned mostly with smuggling, gambling and local feuds. But now, under the persuasion of activists, their energies are redirected toward the idea of overthrowing the Qing. You attend a clandestine meeting in a temple courtyard. Incense smoke curls upward as men swear oaths over bowls of chicken blood. Expel the Tartars, restore China. Knives flash as symbols of resolve. The mixture of ancient ritual and modern nationalism is unsettling but powerful. Meanwhile, students returning from Japan do not keep their fire to themselves. They pour into schools and associations within China, determined to awaken their peers. In 1907, new-style middle schools and teachers' colleges become hotbeds of agitation. You watch as a lecture on mathematics quietly turns into a debate about constitutions, as a physical education class transforms into military drill. The schoolyard is no longer innocent. It is a rehearsal ground for political struggle. The Qing government senses the danger. After abolishing the examination system in 1905, it had hoped to channel youthful ambition into modern education loyal to the dynasty. But instead, schools become laboratories of dissent. By 1908, student strikes erupt in Hunan, Sichuan and Guangdong, protesting tuition fees, abusive administrators, and above all the lethargy of the court. Slogans are shouted, "Down with corruption, save the nation." For the first time, mass protest enters the vocabulary of modern China. In Shanghai, you sit in the audience at a new phenomenon, political drama. On stage, actors in modern dress perform plays with titles like The Black Slave's Cry to Heaven or The Bloody Revolution of 1911. Though censored, the allegories are transparent. Tyrannical rulers, brave martyrs, betrayed patriots. The audience erupts in cheers, sometimes in tears. Theatre has become another weapon of mobilization, igniting imagination beyond the reach of textbooks. But the most dramatic sparks come not from words, but from guns. Between 1907 and 1910, the Tongmenghui attempts no fewer than 7 uprisings across southern China, in Anqing, Huizhou, Qinzhou, Zhenangguan, Guangzhou. You find yourself following young men, many barely out of school, marching with homemade bombs and smuggled rifles. They believe, with burning conviction, that one successful strike will bring the Qing edifice tumbling down. The reality is harsh. Each uprising is crushed. In Huizhou, revolutionaries scatter into the hills, hunted like animals. In Guangzhou, a group of 72 martyrs die in the streets, their bodies left exposed as warnings. You picture the faces of these students, once hunched over books in Tokyo, now lifeless under the sun. Yet instead of extinguishing the cause, their deaths become legends. Poems are written, portraits distributed, graves turned into pilgrimage sites. Failure, paradoxically, spreads the fire further. Meanwhile, within the Qing court, a different drama unfolds. The Guangxu Emperor dies in 1908, a day before the formidable Empress Dowager Cixi also passes. The throne is left to a child, the 2-year-old Puyi. Power falls into the hands of regents and cautious officials. They promise constitutional reform, issuing an outline for a future parliament, but only after 9 years of preparation. To a populace increasingly impatient, this feels like mockery. 9 years, students shout. 9 years and the nation will already be lost. The press seizes on this frustration. Cartoons depict the Qing court as a snail crawling toward reform, while foreign powers carve up the map of China. Editorials thunder that a nation without urgency is a nation without hope. In provincial assemblies, newly permitted by the Dynasty in 1909, delegates clash with appointed officials, demanding real power. For the first time, politics spills from secret rooms into semi-public institutions. Abroad, Sun Yat-sen tirelessly raises funds and recruits. From Southeast Asia to America, overseas Chinese merchants pour donations into the revolutionary cause. You walk through a Chinatown hall in Singapore. watching as shopkeepers place coins into boxes marked National Salvation. The diaspora, long excluded from Qing concerns, now becomes a vital artery of support. By 1910, the mood across China is electric, volatile. Peasants burdened by taxes, workers in foreign-owned factories, intellectuals with new ideas, merchants squeezed by foreign competition, all feel a common discontent. The Qing attempts patches, modern police, new schools, constitutional promises. But the structure creaks. You sense in the hum of tea houses and the scribbles of schoolchildren that something is nearing a breaking point. One night, in a small Shanghai room lit by kerosene lamps, a circle of students read aloud from a smuggled pamphlet. The words echo in the silence. The empire is dying. The people must rise. Revolution is not crime. It is salvation. They nod, some with fear, others with exhilaration. Outside, the city sleeps, unaware that these whispers will soon roar into the Xinhai Revolution. And you, standing at the threshold of history, feel the air itself trembling with anticipation. As you step back from the whirlwind of the last 15 chapters, the path of China's reform and resistance from the late 19th century to 1910 comes into sharper focus. What began as cautious proposals in court chambers, the pleas of Kang Yuwei, Liang Qichao, and their circle for 100 days of reform, ended in suppression, exile, and blood. Yet failure never erased the ideas, it only scattered them wider. From the lecture halls of Tokyo to the coffee houses of Shanghai, from the classrooms of Hunan to the tea houses of Guangdong, words like citizen, parliament, and republic became seeds planted in restless soil. Even when uprisings collapsed in gunfire, the martyrs' sacrifices gave the slogans flesh and spirit. Every pamphlet smuggled across borders, every editorial seized by censors, every oath sworn in secret societies carried the same pulse. China must awaken or vanish. The Qing dynasty, weakened by foreign debt, foreign pressure and internal hesitation, could not contain this rising tide. Its promises of reform rang hollow, delayed too long, offered too little. The people, students, merchants, peasants, migrants, learned to organize themselves, to strike, to demand. And for the first time in centuries, politics escaped the monopoly of the throne and entered the streets. Looking back, you see how the Duitan movement was less a straight road than a series of experiments. Petitions, schools, newspapers, plays, protests, uprisings. Each failure built momentum for the next attempt. Each small voice joined into a chorus, and by 1910, that chorus had become thunder, rolling toward the inevitable storm. The story of modern China was about to enter its decisive chapter, the Revolution of 1911. But the roots of that upheaval lay here, in the restless reformers and dreamers who dared to imagine a different future.